The night Nora Callahan decided to spend her last $350 on a crumbling mill that hadn't ground grain in 46 years, she was sitting in the passenger seat of her sister's Honda Civic watching frost form on the inside of the windshield. Her daughter Lily was asleep across the back seat, 9 years old and curled into herself beneath a sleeping bag they'd bought at a Goodwill 3 towns over when they finally stopped pretending the situation was temporary. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Her son Marcus sat beside her in the front, eating a bag of peanuts one at a time, making them last. He was 14 years old. He had not complained once in 11 weeks. 11 weeks was how long they had been living in the car. Not by choice. It had never been a choice, not the kind you made in advance with full information and time to think. It was the kind of choice that happened to you through a sequence of smaller decisions, each one reasonable at the time, each one bringing you to a place you couldn't quite have predicted from where you'd been standing when you made it. 6 months before the night in the parking lot, Nora had been renting a 2-bedroom apartment on Marsh Street in Haverford, working 32 hours a week at a property management firm that handled commercial real estate for clients who had enough money to make the firm feel stable and permanent. She had a kitchen table they'd eaten dinner at every night. She had a couch with a broken leg she'd propped up with a stack of old textbooks. She had a routine, a grocery list, a check she sent to Marcus's school for the fall activities fund. She had a life that was not comfortable in any luxurious sense, but was manageable. And manageable was something she'd learned to value the same way you value water when you've been thirsty. Her husband Daniel had left when Lily was 4 and Marcus was 9. He'd left a note on the kitchen table that said he needed to find himself, which Nora had never quite forgiven, not because it was dramatic or cruel, but because it was so ordinary. Men who needed to find themselves had been leaving notes like that on kitchen tables since before the phrase even existed, and she'd always thought she was too practical a person to be left by one. He sent money sometimes, inconsistently, and never quite enough, but sometimes. Then the property management firm lost its 2 largest clients in the same fiscal quarter. Then Nora's hours were cut from 32 to 18, and then from 18 to 0 with 2 weeks of severance. Then the apartment's landlord raised the rent $400 a month with 60 days' notice because the building had changed ownership and the new owner was running numbers differently. Then Marcus needed orthodontic work the dentist said had become urgent, and the bill was $2,800 even with insurance. Then the car needed a new alternator. Then Daniel stopped sending money entirely because he had moved to Colorado with a woman named Bree and started a landscaping business and apparently needed every dollar he earned to get it established. The math stopped working in September. By October, it was broken past any reasonable repair. They were out of the apartment in early November, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, which was a timing Nora would later think had a particular quality of cruelty to it, though she never said so to the kids. She remembered the last morning in the apartment with the specific clarity that comes from knowing, in the moment, that you are experiencing something you will carry with you for the rest of your life. She woke at 4:45 a.m. with the particular alertness of someone who has spent weeks running calculations in their sleep. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table they were leaving behind because it belonged to the apartment and not to her, and drank the coffee in the dark and looked at the walls where Marcus had marked his heights over the years, pencil lines with dates beside them, and she did not erase them. She left them there for whoever came next. She'd told the kids the night before, not the full weight of it, not the length of what this might mean, but the immediate reality. They were going to stay with Aunt Brenda for a while. She made it sound temporary, and she believed, in that moment, that it was. Lily had cried briefly and then fallen asleep mid-cry the way children do, grief running out of fuel before it runs out of cause. Marcus had said nothing at all, which was worse than crying, and had gone to his room and started methodically packing his things, organizing them, making them smaller and more portable, with the focused efficiency of someone doing the one thing they could actually control. Her sister Brenda had a 2-bedroom house in Conshohocken. She offered to let them stay, which was generous, and she meant it generously. And the generosity lasted almost exactly 3 weeks before the passive-aggressive notes about the dishes started appearing on the kitchen counter. Nora had known Brenda her entire life, had loved her and argued with her and relied on her and been frustrated by her across 42 years, and she understood her sister better than Brenda understood herself. The notes were not a sign that Brenda was a bad person. They were a sign that Brenda had reached the edge of her capacity and didn't know how to say so directly. Nora had packed their things one morning while Brenda was at work and driven away before either of them had to say something they'd spend years trying to unsay. She'd asked about the shelter on Route 30. The wait list was 6 weeks. She'd called back 2 weeks later. It was 8 weeks. 2 weeks after that, 10. She filed an application anyway and kept calling, but calling a shelter from a gas station parking lot in Pennsylvania in December had the quality of a prayer, sincere and entirely dependent on things outside your control. She had applied for 27 jobs since the property management firm cut her hours. 4 had called back. 1 had hired her for 2 weeks of temporary work that ended 3 days before Thanksgiving. The others had gone with candidates whose situations were, she supposed, less complicated. She had applied for food assistance and received it after a 22-day processing delay. She had applied for emergency housing assistance and been told the program was closed to new applications until the following fiscal year. She had kept applying anyway because stopping felt like a decision she wasn't ready to make. Marcus figured out they were living in the car by the 3rd day. He didn't say anything about it. He just started double-checking that all 4 doors were locked at night before he fell asleep, silently, without being asked. Lily had asked twice when they were going home and then stopped asking. Children are precise about the things they sense, even when they can't name what they're sensing. The night in the Sunoco parking lot was a Tuesday in December. The temperature outside the car was 23 degrees. Nora had $358 in her checking account and a prepaid phone with $60 of credit, and she was scrolling through the county's online property auction listings because she sometimes did that when she couldn't sleep, the same way some people scrolled news or social media or recipes they'd never cook. The county auctioned off properties with unpaid tax liens. Most of what showed up was either environmentally contaminated or structurally condemned or both. She'd never bid on anything. She looked the way you look at possibility when you're not quite sure you believe in it anymore, but haven't managed to stop looking either. The Whitmore mill was listed under agricultural/industrial, a category most people skipped, on page 7. The attached photograph had been taken from the road on a gray day and showed a 4-story stone building behind 40 years of tree growth, one corner of the roof sagging inward. The legal description ran to 3 paragraphs and was mostly easements and tax citations, but buried in the second paragraph was a sentence she read 3 times. Parcel includes primary mill structure, attached grain storage annex, and secondary residential dwelling, approximately 650 square feet, current habitability status unknown. 650 square feet. Unknown habitability. Unknown was not no. Unknown was a word that meant the county hadn't sent anyone out to look, which meant the answer could go either direction, which meant there was a possibility, a small, cold, unreasonable possibility, of a roof. For walls. A door that locked. She sat in the dark with the gas station lights throwing orange across the frost on the windshield, and she thought about the gap between $358 and $350, and she thought about Marcus eating peanuts one at a time to make them last, and she thought about the particular exhaustion of practical optimism, the kind where you keep problem-solving not because you believe it will necessarily work, but because you haven't found anything better to do. At 11:47 p.m., she submitted a bid of $350. She plugged her phone into the car charger when the battery dipped below 10% and then sat in the dark listening to Marcus breathe, and somewhere in that listening she fell asleep. The confirmation came at 6:14 in the morning. She was the only bidder. The Whitmore grain mill all won. 3 acres of it, the stone building and the grain annex and the cottage of unknown habitability, was hers. She sat with that for a while before Marcus woke up, just sat with it, holding the fact of it carefully. She had spent almost everything she had on a building the county couldn't give away, on a photograph of sagging limestone in a field, on a secondary residential dwelling of unknown habitability that might, when she arrived, be nothing more than 4 stone walls and a roof she couldn't live under. She thought about calling Brenda and decided against it, not because she was avoiding the conversation, but because she needed a few minutes to fully own the decision before she explained it to someone who was going to worry about it. She sat in the car and looked at the confirmation and thought about a building that had been sitting empty for 46 years and all the people who had seen the listing and decided it wasn't worth $350 and moved on. They weren't wrong, probably. She knew that. But they hadn't gone to look. And she was going to look. Marcus woke and read her face before she'd said anything. What happened? She held out her phone. He read the listing. He looked at the photograph. He looked at her. He was 14 years old, and he was old enough to understand the situation with accuracy and young enough that hope still occasionally outran accuracy, and she watched him decide, very deliberately, to let hope take the lead. Okay, he said. Okay. She called Brenda from the parking lot, while Lily ate a granola bar in the back seat. You spent nearly everything on a mill, Brenda said. Most of it. Nora, you cannot be serious. It has a cottage. With unknown habitability. Unknown means I don't know yet. It means I'm going to find out. You have $8 left. 6. I did the math this morning. A pause. Brenda, I need it somewhere. For the kids. This might be that somewhere. I'm going to look at it today. And if it's uninhabitable, then I figure out the next thing. That's what I've been doing. Brenda made a sound somewhere between worry and exasperation. The sound she'd been making at Nora since they were children, and Nora heard in it everything she'd always heard in it. The love and the frustration and the fundamental difference between them. Brenda managing the world through careful worry, Nora moving through it by keeping her feet moving. They were not opposites. They were the same kind of stubborn expressed in two completely different directions. Call me when you've seen it, Brenda said finally. Whatever it is, call me. I will, Nora said, and meant it. She drove to Alderton Township on back roads that wound through rural Pennsylvania the way back roads in rural Pennsylvania do, following the contours of a landscape that was indifferent to destination. The terrain changed gradually from suburb to farmland, strip mall to woodlet, convenience store to a gas station with one pump and a hand-lettered sign advertising night crawlers. The road narrowed as it headed into the township proper. Trees pressed closer on both sides. Fields opened on the right and then closed again. The GPS told her to turn onto Millrace Road. Millrace Road was exactly what the name suggested, a road that had grown up alongside the old Millrace, the channel that had once carried water from the creek to the mill wheel. You could still see the depression of it in the overgrown field to the left, following the road at a distance of about 30 feet, filled now with cattails and brown standing water and the tilted remains of what had been a footbridge at some point, its wooden planks long since given back to the earth. The mill appeared around a bend in the road. She pulled over and stopped the car. She had told herself on the entire 40-minute drive that the county photograph had made it look worse than it was, that official listing photos were never flattering, that she was bracing herself for a pleasant surprise. She had done this with the focused intention of someone preparing psychologically for a positive outcome. She was not surprised pleasantly. The Whitmore mill was 4 stories of pale limestone that had been a significant piece of construction in its time and remained significant now primarily through sheer mass. The stone was solid. She could see that even from the road. The kind of masonry built by people who intended the building to outlast them by generations and had been right. But almost everything built of wood had not survived alongside the stone, and 46 years of weather and neglect had made the difference very clear. The window frames on the upper 2 floors had rotted away entirely, leaving dark openings through which she could see only shadow and, on the top floor, the movement of pigeons whose cooing reached the car even through the closed windows. A section of the 4th floor roof had given way at its northeast corner, leaving a gap that weather had been working through for years. The trees that had grown up around the building were not decorative. They were advancing. An oak on the south side had grown close enough to the limestone wall that the distinction between tree and building required deliberate attention to see clearly. The grain storage annex attached to the mill's east side looked worse. One wall had partially separated from the main structure at the roofline, creating a gap wide enough to see sky through. Marcus had gotten out of the car without her noticing and was standing at her shoulder. He stood there for a moment without speaking. The stone walls look solid, he said. They do. The rest of it is bad. Yes. Where's the cottage? She checked the plat map on her phone. Behind the main building. On the creek side. They left Lily asleep in the back seat and walked the gravel drive that curved around the mill's north side, their feet crunching through weeds that had reclaimed the gravel from the center outward. The drive brought them around the back of the building, and there, Set back from the mill's south wall by maybe 30 feet was the cottage. Small. She had expected small, and still the smallness of it was something she had to stand with for a moment before she could assess it clearly. Stone on the lower half, wood frame on the upper, and the wood had taken the years much harder than the stone had. The porch had partially collapsed, one end dropping toward the ground at an angle that made it look like it was trying to sit down. One east-facing window was boarded with plywood that had warped and pulled away from the frame at the upper left corner. But the roof was intact. She stood in the overgrown grass and looked at it with the careful attention of someone for whom a roof was not an aesthetic detail, but a fundamental fact. And what she saw was present shingles, worn but present, no missing sections, no gaps where the sky showed through. The stone foundation was solid to the eye. The front door was in its frame and appeared to close. She crossed to it and used the county's key on the deadbolt. The key fit. The lock turned. The door opened. The smell inside was decades of closed-up air, old wood and mineral stone and dust, the particular stillness of a space that has been waiting without knowing it was waiting. But it was dry. She stood in the main room and moved her attention slowly across every surface. Walls, ceiling, floor, the corners where water damage announces itself first. She found none of it. The floor was dry underfoot. The ceiling showed no staining. The walls were not soft with rot. The roof was holding what it was supposed to hold. There was a wood stove in the corner, iron, heavy, old, the kind that was built without any particular interest in being attractive and had survived partly because of that indifference. There was a kitchen wall with a counter and a sink and an ancient refrigerator. She found the main electrical breaker in a small box near the door and flipped it. The refrigerator hummed to life. The county had apparently left the utility account connected without anyone noticing, which was an administrative oversight she had no intention of correcting. There was a bathroom with a toilet and a tub and a sink. She turned the tap. Brown water ran for 30 seconds and then ran clear. She stood with clear water running over her palm and cried for the first time since she'd loaded the car at Brenda's house, quietly, with her free hand pressed against her mouth. 60 seconds of it. No more. And then she turned off the tap and dried her hand and went back to the main room. Marcus was standing in the kitchen area. He had her habit of reading a space functionally, seeing what it could do rather than what it looked like, and he'd been doing it while she was in the bathroom. "Electric works," he said. "And water. The pipes are intact." He looked at the wood stove. "That'll heat the whole cottage if we keep the bedroom door shut at night." "It will." He looked at her. There was something careful in his expression, the expression of someone deciding whether to say the thing they want to say or the practical thing. He chose the practical thing, which was what she'd taught him. "Lily's going to say the bedroom's too small. Lily is 9. She doesn't get a vote." He almost smiled. "Okay," he said. "We can do this." They drove back to the Sunoco and loaded everything they owned into the Honda's trunk. It fit. That was still the part, weeks later, that came back to her in quiet moments. Everything they owned fit in one car trunk, and they drove it 40 minutes down a narrowing road to a stone cottage with a wood stove and a bathroom that worked, and they called it home. The first 3 days were cleaning. The county had left the property as it was when Earl Whitmore walked away, which meant decades of accumulated dust, mouse droppings, dead insects, and the general archaeology of abandonment. Nora and Marcus went through every room with mops and buckets and a grim, focused efficiency. They pulled the plywood off the boarded window and replaced it with clear plastic sheeting tacked over the frame, which let light in and kept cold out and was good enough for now. They scrubbed the bathroom tile until it was what it was going to be, which was old but clean. They cleared the wood stove flue and tested it. Lily helped with a seriousness that would have been funny if it hadn't also been moving. She carried things. She held the dustpan. She asked questions about every step of the process and nodded with the grave attention of someone filing information for later use. On the second evening, she arranged the 5 books she'd brought from the apartment on a section of kitchen counter where a shelf might one day go, and stood back and looked at them with an expression of deep satisfaction, as if their presence made the cottage real. Nora found a mattress through the Alderton by Nothing group on the 3rd day and spent 2 hours on it with baking soda and enzyme spray. She found curtains at the Haverford thrift store, yellow cotton, slightly too long, which she pinned up at the hem without sewing. She found a kitchen table at the Habitat Restore for $11, round, with a scratch down one side that Lily covered with a placemat without being asked. By the end of the first week, the cottage was not comfortable, but it had a table they ate dinner at every night and a door that locked from the inside. And Nora had spent 11 weeks without either of those things, and neither one of them was small. The first night, Marcus got the wood stove going after 40 minutes, and one incident involving the damper that filled the kitchen with smoke briefly and then resolved. The heat spread through the cottage the way heat spreads through a small stone space, slowly and then all at once. Lily fell asleep on the bedroom floor in her sleeping bag without complaint, which told Nora more about what the past 3 months had taken from her daughter than any conversation they'd had. She sat at the kitchen table after the kids were asleep and looked at her bank account on her phone. $8.42. She looked at the property tax receipt. Whitmore Grain Mill, 14, Millrace Road, Alderton Township. Owner of record, Nora and Callahan. She sat with those two facts together for a while, and then put her phone down and looked at the wood stove and listened to it tick with heat. In the morning, she drove into Alderton proper to arrange a water test, which was the most urgent practical matter and also the cheapest one. Alderton was 4 miles north on Route 12, small enough that the hardware store and the grocery store shared a parking lot. The kind of town where the diner was called the Alderton Diner with a confidence that came from never having needed a better name. The hardware store's counter was staffed by a woman named Doris, somewhere in her 60s, heavy-set, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She looked at the address on the water sample form, and her expression shifted into something attentive and specific. "You're at the Whitmore place," she said. "Not a question. I bought it at auction." She set down her pen. "The mill and the cottage. Honey." She said it the way people who are direct say gentle things, genuinely gently, and then directly. Earl Whitmore locked that building up in 1978 and walked away from it. Didn't explain why. Didn't tell anyone anything. His family out in Oregon didn't want it when he died in 2004, so it went to the county, and the county has been trying to unload it ever since. She looked at Nora steadily. "Nobody's been inside that building in a very long time." "I know," Nora said. "I bought it." "For how much?" $350. Doris absorbed this without visibly judging it, which Nora appreciated. "You got kids?" "2. You're living in the cottage now." "Moved in yesterday." A pause. Then Doris reached under the counter and produced a business card. "My brother-in-law Phil does structural assessments. He's reasonable and he's honest, which is a combination harder to find than it should be. Call him before you go into the main building. I mean it. That structure has had no maintenance in 46 years, and I don't know what's holding what anymore." Nora took the card. "What do you know about Whitmore?" "The man who owned it." Doris thought about it. "He was old when I was young. Ran the mill for years, going back before I can really remember. Kept to himself. Some people said eccentric, some said private. Hard to know the difference from the outside. He had no children, never married. Had a sister out west he wasn't close with. When he died, the sister's family settled the estate at a distance, didn't come out, didn't want anything to do with the property. Just let it go to the county." She paused, leaning on the counter. "He locked every door on that place before he left. Every exterior door, padlocked. Never told a soul why. People wondered. You know how people wonder. But the wondering didn't get anyone anywhere because the man who had the answers left and didn't come back." Nora drove back to the cottage with the water sample kit and that conversation sitting together in her head. 2 days later, she went to the Alderton Township Public Library, which was open 4 days a week and staffed by a single librarian named Cora, who had the bearing of someone who had read everything and was pleased about it. Nora asked about historical records on the Whitmore Mill, and Cora produced, without any particular surprise, a manila folder of newspaper clippings she said the library had been keeping since the building came up in the county's auction listings for years running. The oldest clipping was from the Alderton Weekly Register, dated 1974, a brief feature on local businesses that included a photograph of the mill in operation, the building's exterior clean and functional, grain deliveries visible in the background, Earl Whitmore himself standing in the doorway with a hand raised against the sun. He looked to be in his 60s in the photograph, heavy-set, with the posture of someone who spent his days on his feet. The caption identified him as the mill's third-generation owner. The next clipping was from 1978, a short notice from the same paper. The Whitmore grain mill had ceased operations as of October of that year. No reason given. The paper had apparently called Whitmore for comment, and he had declined to provide one. The clippings after that were shorter, further apart. A 1985 note about vandalism at the property, 2 broken windows. A 1992 piece about the county's efforts to contact Whitmore about tax arrears, which had apparently been settled by mail without Whitmore returning to the township. A brief 2004 obituary. Earl Thomas Whitmore, aged 82, lifelong resident of Alderton Township, owner of the historic Whitmore grain mill. Survived by a sister in Portland, Oregon. No memorial service planned. Nora looked at the obituary for a while. No memorial service planned. A lifelong resident of a township whose library kept a folder of clippings about his building, and no memorial service planned. She flipped back to the 1974 photograph. The man in the doorway with his hand raised against the sun. Third-generation owner. She thought about what third generation meant, what it meant to own something your grandfather had built, to run a building that had your family's history in its walls. You did not walk away from that without a reason. You did not decline all comment and settle your tax bills by mail and die without a service in a town where everyone knew your name unless you were carrying something heavy enough that ordinary social life had become impossible to manage. She made copies of the clippings on the library's ancient photocopier and put them in her bag and thanked Cora, who pressed a second manila folder into her hands on the way out. History of the mill, as a building, Cora said. Architectural notes, construction records, what we have. I thought you might want it, since you're the new owner. Nora sat in the car in the library parking lot and looked through the second folder for 20 minutes. The mill had been built in 1911 by a man named George Whitmore, Earl's grandfather, using limestone quarried from a site 4 miles to the east. The construction had taken 2 years. The mill had been in continuous operation from 1913 to 1978, 65 years of grinding grain for farms across 3 counties. She put the folders in her bag and drove back to the cottage. That evening, she spread the photocopied clippings on the kitchen table after dinner and looked at them for a long time, particularly at the 1974 photograph, at the building's exterior in its operational years, at the south face of the mill clearly visible behind Whitmore in the frame. 2 windows at ground level, one to either side of the main door, and behind them she could see the interior of the main room she'd been learning floor by floor. She measured the windows in the photograph with her thumb, comparing them to the building's exterior proportions. There were, in the 1974 photograph, 2 windows in the south face's ground floor. The one she knew, the one now covered with plywood from the outside, and a second one, to the right of where the main room ended. She looked at the photograph for a very long time. In the 1974 photograph, there was a window in the south face of the mill that, in the current building, did not exist. Phil came the next day. He spent 3 hours on the property and produced a handwritten assessment that was thorough and direct and only sometimes optimistic. The main building's limestone walls were structurally sound throughout. The foundation, set on bedrock, was not cracked, not shifted. The ground and second floors were navigable with caution. The third and fourth were not safe without additional shoring. The collapsed section of the 4th floor roof needed attention before winter snow load made it worse. The grain annex should be left alone until its separated wall was addressed. The cottage was livable with cleaning and minor repairs. He handed her the report, told her the fee was whatever she could manage and to pay him when she was able, and drove away before she could argue with him about it. She sat with the assessment that night while Lily slept and Marcus did homework at the kitchen table and thought about what the building was, what it could be, what the gap between those 2 things required. She had looked at historic preservation grant applications online and noted that the mill was almost certainly eligible. She had looked at small business loans. She had emailed 2 architects whose websites mentioned adaptive reuse projects. She had no money, which meant that every possible path forward started with convincing someone else the property had value, which required her to first understand it well enough to describe it accurately and credibly, which required her to actually go inside and learn what it was. She needed to know what was in the building. She went in on the 3rd day, alone, with a flashlight and her phone camera and the careful, methodical approach she'd developed through years of assessing properties for other people's benefit. She followed Phil's guidance precisely, staying where the framing was sound, testing the floor with each step before committing her weight. The ground floor had enough window light once her eyes adjusted that she kept the flashlight mostly for corners and detail work. The ground floor of the Whitmore mill was a single large room, maybe 60 feet long and 40 feet wide, with 12-foot ceilings and heavy timber beams overhead. The milling equipment was still there. Not complete, not in working order, but present in the way that things are present when no one has decided what to do with them. Millstones set in wooden frames. Belt-driven mechanisms attached to nothing. Iron gears locked with rust. Wooden hoppers warped and split, but not entirely collapsed. The arrangement still had a logic she could read if she stood in one spot long enough. Grain intake on the east wall. Processing through the central mechanisms. Bagging area on the west. 100 years ago, this room had been loud and purposeful and full of dust, and now it was quiet, and everything about it was still in exactly the conversation with its original use that it had been in the day Earl Whitmore locked the door and drove away. She documented everything on her phone, measured where she could, pacing out the room's dimensions. Found the old office desk in the southeast corner with papers in its drawers too degraded to read, but the desk itself solid enough to be worth something. Found, along the north wall, a wooden staircase that was missing its banister but retained its treads, each of which she pressed with her foot before trusting it. She went up to the second floor and documented that too, working quickly, aware of the roof situation above her. She came back the second day and looked at things she'd only photographed the first time. She examined the millstones at length, the carved furrows in the granite worn smooth in places from 65 years of use. She found, under one of the hopper frames, a tin lunchbox left and forgotten, its contents corroded past identification, but its presence real and humanizing. She found, near the east wall, a section of floor where the timber had been replaced after the original construction, the replacement boards lighter and their grain running differently. She photographed it and made a note. She found, on the north wall near the staircase base, pencil marks in columns, numbers she couldn't fully interpret but documented anyway. She came back the third day and went to the south wall for the first time. She pressed her hand against the limestone and looked at the sealed mill race shaft, the iron connection to the water wheel outside, capped in stone some years after operations ended. She looked at the window, the deep-sealed opening covered with plywood. She noticed where the window sat in the wall, and then looked away, and then looked back. She came back the fourth day with the photocopied 1974 newspaper clipping from the library. She held it up in the light and looked at it carefully. The south face of the building, visible behind Whitmore in the photograph. 2 windows at ground level in the south wall. The one she knew, and a second one, farther to the right, in a section of the exterior that corresponded to nothing in the interior she'd been measuring. She paced the room again. She compared the numbers. She stood in front of the south wall and looked at it for a very long time. That evening she spread all her photographs on the kitchen table and sat with them until after the kids were asleep. On the 5th day she brought Marcus. He moved through the space with a seriousness she recognized, the same focused quiet she used herself in places that needed to be read rather than merely seen. He stopped at the millstones and ran his fingers along the carved grooves in the granite surface. He asked her about the process, where the grain had entered and how it had moved through the machinery and what had come out at the end. She explained it as clearly as she could from what she'd worked out, and he listened with the full attention he reserved for things that genuinely interested him, building a mental model of the space in real time. The equipment might be worth something, he said, to a preservation group or a museum. Intact sets like this are unusual. I've been thinking the same thing. You've been looking it up? Last night. There's a historic mill society. They sometimes assist with restoration projects, not just money but expertise. She looked at him. Keep at it. I will. He walked the perimeter of the room slowly, the way she did, and she watched him build his own map of the space. He stopped at the south wall, the one that held the sealed mill race shaft, and stood there with his hands in his pockets looking at it. Did you measure this wall? He asked. She checked her notes on her phone. I measured the room's full length east to west and the north wall separately. I haven't done the south wall on its own. Come here. She crossed to him. Look at the window, he said. The window in the south wall was a deep-sealed stone opening about 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, its frame long gone, the opening covered with plywood from the outside. It's centered in the wall. Symmetrical, right? Same distance of stone on both sides. Yes. Now look at where it sits from inside, relative to the whole room. She shifted her perspective, measuring with her eyes. The window, centered in the south wall, sat near the left end of the room's southern boundary as she faced it. She looked at the north wall, the east and west walls, ran the geometry. The window is centered in the wall, she said slowly. But the wall isn't centered in the room. Right? The wall is positioned toward the room's right side, which means the building has to extend farther to the left to the south than this room does. This room doesn't go all the way to the south exterior wall. Nora was already looking at the south wall differently. She walked its length, pacing it, then walked outside through the main door and paced the south face of the exterior. She came back in. The interior room measured 41 feet east to west. The exterior south face measured just over 53 feet, 12 feet of building with no corresponding room. She stood in the middle of the ground floor and looked at the south wall. Heavy limestone block, mortar from the original construction, consistent and weathered. She pressed her knuckles against it and knocked, moving along the surface slowly, listening. For most of its length the knock was flat and dense, the sound of solid mass absorbing impact. But in one section, a span of maybe 8 feet running from the sealed mill race shaft toward the southeast corner, the sound was different. Not hollow, but different. Marginally higher. The sound of stone backed by something other than more stone. She knocked along the boundary of that section until she had its dimensions clearly in her ear. Marcus had been watching her. There's something behind there. There might be. You know there is. She moved to the south wall and got down on her hands and knees and held her flashlight at a low angle, raking the beam across the base of the wall. The mortar in the general run of the wall was old and consistent, deeply weathered, the kind of mortar that had set in the first decade of the 20th century and had been hardening quietly ever since. But in the base of that 8-foot section, the mortar was different, lighter in color, a different texture at the surface, less weathered, more recent. The difference was subtle enough that you would not see it in general lighting, would not see it standing upright. You had to be on the ground, flashlight low, specifically looking. She moved the flashlight upward along the same section. At the ceiling, 9 feet up, she found the corresponding horizontal seam. Same lighter mortar, same different texture. She examined the left edge of the section and found a vertical seam, the same newer mortar running the full height from floor seam to ceiling seam. She moved to the right edge. The same. A rectangle, 8 feet wide, 9 feet tall, for seams of newer mortar. An opening that had been filled in, and then the entire wall painted over so that the seams became near invisible under a coat of paint that had long since gone chalky with age. If you were not looking for it specifically, if you had not already known from your measurements that there was something to look for, you would walk past it every time. Someone had filled in an opening in this wall, made the work look like original construction, and then painted over the evidence of it. The work was dated, by the mortar's aging, to somewhere in the mid-20th century. Perhaps the 1940s. Perhaps the 1950s. Decades before Earl Whitmore locked his doors and walked away. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She stood up slowly. She put her back against the north wall and looked at the sealed section from 20 feet away. She thought about Earl Whitmore locking every door and driving away without an explanation. She thought about Doris saying people wondered, but the wondering hadn't gotten anyone anywhere. She thought about 12 feet of building that had no room, about a doorway sealed with newer mortar and painted over, about the particular effort of making something look like it had never been different. You did not paint over the seams because you were sealing off a damaged section. You did not take that additional step unless you had a reason to make the closure look permanent and original. Unless you had a reason you did not want anyone who came after you to question. And there was the photograph. The second window visible in the south face in 1974, present 4 years before Whitmore locked his doors and left, now gone from the exterior without any record of why. Someone had blocked it from the inside and then bricked it over from outside, and then painted over the brickwork until it was gone. They had removed a window from a building's history. They had sealed a room and then erased the evidence of the room's existence as thoroughly as stone and mortar and paint allowed. "Mom," Marcus said, "can we open it?" Not without knowing what's on the other side first, and not without understanding why it was sealed. He looked at the wall. He looked at the mortar seams, nearly invisible unless you were already looking, obvious now that they knew where to look. He was quiet for a moment, working through something, and she let him work. Then he said it. "Mama, someone sealed this room shut." 6 words, quietly delivered, in the voice of a 14-year-old boy who was trying very hard to be measured about something that didn't feel entirely measurable. The words had the quality of an acknowledgement, the moment when a thing you have been sensing but not quite allowing yourself to say out loud gets said and becomes real by virtue of being named. She pressed her palm flat against the limestone, cold and solid and indifferent, the stone of a building that had been standing for 113 years and had been keeping its southern secret for at least 70 of them. She thought about Earl Whitmore. Eccentric or private, no one had been able to tell the difference from the outside. He had locked every door and left without explaining why and died without explaining why. And perhaps the reason was standing behind this wall, behind 12 feet of discrepancy, behind newer mortar painted over to look old. Perhaps the reason was why he'd locked every door in the first place, not to protect the building itself, but to protect what the building contained. She thought about why you sealed a room in a working mill. Not for structural reasons, because the stone was sound throughout. Not for safety reasons, because there was no record of an incident in the building's history. Not for convenience, because a room in a working mill was an asset, not a complication. You sealed a room in a working mill because the room contained something you did not want anyone to find. She stood with her palm on the stone and let that thought settle into the specific weight it deserved. They had been in the car for 11 weeks. They had moved into a cottage in Alderton Township with a wood stove and $8 in the bank. She had bought a mill that everyone else had passed over, on a photograph she'd found at midnight, with money she could not afford to spend, because a building was a possibility and possibility was the only thing she'd had left to work with. And now, in the cold and the dust and the particular silence of a place that had been keeping something to itself for longer than either of them had been alive, her son had said the thing that named what she already knew. Someone had sealed this room shut. She pulled her hand away from the stone and looked at Marcus. He was watching her with the expression he got when he was waiting for direction, not because he couldn't think for himself, but because he was choosing to move with her rather than ahead of her. "Tomorrow," she said, "we find out everything there is to find about Earl Whitmore and this building. County records, historical society, whatever anyone in Alderton remembers. All of it. And then we figure out how to open this wall." She turned and walked toward the door and did not look back at the sealed section, not because she'd stopped thinking about it, but because she was already several steps ahead, already sorting through what came next, already building the list of what she needed to know before she could act. She moved through the dim light of the ground floor and out through the heavy door into the cold gray Pennsylvania afternoon, and behind her the mill was silent, the way it had been silent for 46 years, the way it had been keeping its 12 feet of discrepancy and its newer mortar and its sealed room to itself since sometime in the middle of the last century. The afternoon air was cold in the particular way of Pennsylvania in winter, damp and direct, carrying the smell of the creek somewhere below the property line. Nora stood on the flat stone step outside the main door and looked out at the overgrown field and the tree line beyond it and the pale winter sky above that. Marcus stood beside her, his hands in his pockets, not saying anything. She had spent 11 weeks in a car. She had spent those 11 weeks being told by the weight of circumstance, by wait lists and declining balances and the arithmetic of insufficient income, that she was running out of room, that the options were narrowing, that the margin between where she was and where she could not afford to be was shrinking by the week. And she had bought a mill, not because she was impulsive, though some people, Brenda included, would have used that word, because she had looked at a listing that everyone else had skipped, had read past the photograph to the second paragraph, had held the word unknown in her mind long enough to understand that it was not the same word as no. She had always been good at that, at finding the gap between what people said was impossible and what was actually impossible, which were not always the same gap. She didn't know what was behind the south wall of the Whitmore mill. She didn't know whether it was something that would change anything or something that would turn out to have a reasonable explanation, sealed off decades ago for reasons that were practical and ordinary and ultimately uninteresting. She didn't know. That was the honest answer. But she knew how to find out. And she was going to find out. That was not bravery, she thought. Or at least not only bravery. It was the same thing that had kept her making calls to the shelter when the wait list was at 10 weeks, the same thing that had kept her filing job applications when the response rate was nearly zero. The understanding that the only thing that definitely didn't work was stopping. She pulled her coat tighter against the cold. "Come on," she said to Marcus. "Let's get back to Lily before she's eaten everything in the kitchen." He almost smiled. They walked back around the side of the mill toward the cottage, their feet quiet on the winter grass, the building's limestone walls rising beside them, solid and patient, keeping what they'd been keeping for 7 decades, waiting just a little longer. It had been waiting for someone who would look carefully enough to notice. Nora Callahan was that person. She just didn't know yet what looking carefully was going to cost her. Nora did not sleep well that night. She lay in the cottage bedroom on the mattress from the Buy Nothing group and stared at the ceiling while Lily breathed steadily beside her and Marcus's sleeping bag rustled occasionally in the corner, and she thought about 12 feet of building and newer mortar and a man who had locked his doors and driven away without a word. She thought about the second window in the 1974 photograph, present in the south face of the building in the last years of the mill's operation, then gone, bricked over and painted to match, gone so thoroughly that you would not know to look for it unless you already knew it had been there. Someone had decided that window needed to not exist anymore, and they had done the work to make it not exist, and then they had locked all the doors and driven away. And that had been 1978, 46 years ago, and in 46 years nobody had looked carefully enough to notice. Until now. She got up at 5:30, before either of the kids stirred, and sat at the kitchen table with her phone and the photocopied newspaper clippings from the library, and a cup of coffee made from the last of the grounds she'd bought before the bank account got this thin. She laid everything out in front of her and looked at it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The 1974 newspaper photograph showed the mill's south face with 2 windows at ground level. Both windows were clear, both functional, the kind of windows a working building used for light and air. The window on the left she knew. It was the window in the main room, the one now covered with plywood from the outside. The window on the right sat in the section of exterior wall that corresponded to the missing 12 feet of interior space. Both windows had the same deep stone sills, the same proportions. They had been made at the same time, by the same hands, in the same construction. The right window no longer existed. Not boarded up, not bricked and left obviously bricked. Gone. Removed, and the exterior wall, made continuous again, stone matching stone so closely that you would have to know precisely where to look to see the fill. She thought about the effort that required. The physical work of removing a window and rebuilding the wall from the outside, matching the limestone carefully enough to pass casual inspection. Someone who knew masonry. Someone with access to matching stone, which meant access to the same quarry or a very good eye for sourcing. Someone who had done this deliberately and carefully and then painted the whole south face to make the repair invisible. This was not something you did on a weekend. This was a project. She thought about what kind of project required that level of care. When Marcus came into the kitchen at 7, she had 4 pages of notes on her phone and a clearer picture of what she needed to do. He poured himself water from the tap and leaned against the counter and looked at her the way he'd been looking at her for 11 weeks, with the particular attention of a child who has learned to read a parent's face for information about the state of the world. "You didn't sleep," he said. "Not much. What do you need?" She looked at him. 14 years old, water glass in his hand, asking what she needed as if that were the natural and obvious question, as if he'd been asking it for years. He had been asking it for years. "County records," she said. "Building permits. If someone made changes to this building after the original construction, there should be a record of it. Or there should be a record that no permit was pulled, which tells us something different. How far back do county records go? Far enough, probably. This county has been keeping records since the 1800s. She stood and carried her coffee mug to the sink. "I also want to find someone who actually knew Earl Whitmore. Someone who worked with him or knew his family. Doris might know who to ask." "What about opening the wall?" She looked at him. "Not yet. Not until we understand what we're doing and why it was sealed. We don't touch that wall until we know more." Marcus nodded. He understood the logic, even if she could see he was impatient with it. He was her son in that way too. He wanted to act, but he understood the cost of acting before you had enough information. They left Lily with a bowl of oatmeal and the instruction to stay in the cottage and drove into Alderton. The county assessor's office opened at 8:30 and Nora was in the parking lot at 8:20. The clerk inside, a young man named Trevor who had the resigned patience of someone working a job they had not planned to work, pulled up the property record for 14 Millrace Road and walked her through what was available. The original construction permit for the Whitmore mill was filed in 1910 and finalized in 1913 when the building passed inspection. The permit was thorough by the standards of its time, specifying materials and dimensions in the careful language of a period when civic record-keeping was taken seriously. After the original permit, there were 3 subsequent records attached to the property. A 1931 filing for roof repairs on the grain annex, a 1958 record for an electrical upgrade, which would have been when rural Pennsylvania electrification reached this part of Alderton Township, and a 1947 permit. Nora read the 1947 permit twice. It described, in the formal dry language of municipal records, an interior modification to the ground floor of the main mill structure, the removal and relocation of internal partition elements, and the installation of reinforced flooring in the southeast section of the building. The permit had been filed by one Harold Whitmore, which she noted was not Earl but a generation before Earl, presumably Earl's father. The work had been approved and signed off by a county inspector named W. R. Fulton, now certainly dead, and the notation was routine, bureaucratic, showing nothing unusual. Except, the modification involved the southeast section of the building's ground floor, which was exactly where the sealed room was. And the permit said reinforced flooring. Not walls. Not a partition. Flooring. She stood at the counter looking at the photocopy Trevor had made for her and thought about what reinforced flooring in the southeast section of a mill meant in 1947. Flooring capable of bearing additional weight. A floor designed to hold something heavy. She drove from the assessor's office to the hardware store. Doris was at the counter, reading glasses on, working through what appeared to be an invoice. She looked up when Nora came through the door, and her expression shifted into something that was not quite welcoming and not quite wariness either. The expression of someone who has started paying close attention to another person and is waiting to see where their next question goes. Earl Whitmore, Nora said, setting her bag on the counter. Do you know anyone who actually worked with him? Knew him well enough to know something about the family? Doris took her glasses off. Why? Because the building has things in it that I don't understand yet, and I think the answers are in the family's history. A pause. Doris appeared to make a calculation. There's a man named Vernon Cade, she said. He's 81 years old, lives on Route 8 about 4 miles out, and he worked at the Whitmore mill for 11 years, from 1963 to 1974 when his back gave out, and he had to stop. He knew Earl Whitmore better than most people in this township. Better than Earl probably wanted. Will he talk to me? Vernon will talk to anyone who's willing to listen. He's been talking since 1943, and I don't think he plans to stop. She wrote an address on a piece of paper and slid it across the counter. Tell him I sent you. He'll be suspicious of a stranger otherwise. Vernon Cade's house on Route 8 was a small white farmhouse set close to the road, its yard immaculate despite the winter. Its driveway scraped clean of snow and grit with a thoroughness that suggested someone who had nothing but time and took all of it seriously. Vernon himself answered the door within seconds of her knock, as if he'd been standing near it. He was short, heavy-set, and white-haired, with a face that had been weathered by decades outdoors and eyes that moved quickly and missed nothing. Doris Pelham sent you, he said. Not a question. She did. About the Whitmore place. I bought it at the county auction. I'm trying to understand the building's history. He looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door and gestured her inside. Vernon Cade's kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke and the particular warmth of a house that was well heated by a person who lived alone and had decided warmth was a reasonable luxury. He poured coffee without asking if she wanted it, which was either presumptuous or perceptive. Nora accepted it and sat at his kitchen table and told him what she'd found, methodically, holding nothing back. The measurement discrepancy, the sealed mortar seams, the missing window, the 1947 permit for reinforced flooring. Vernon sat across from her with his coffee and listened with the quality of attention that very old people sometimes have, the kind that comes from having listened to a great many things over a great many years and having learned which ones were worth full attention. When she finished, He was quiet for a long moment. Harold Whitmore, he said finally. Earl's father. He ran the mill before Earl took over. Old Harold was a quiet man, which people in this area sometimes confused with simple. He wasn't simple. He was careful. There's a difference. He turned the coffee mug in his hands. He died in 1959. I only knew him the last couple of years before that, and even then Earl kept the two of them somewhat separate. Harold was retired by then, mostly, but he came around. What was he like? Harold. Vernon thought about it seriously, in the way he seemed to take most things seriously. He was the kind of man who remembered everything and said very little. You'd see him watching you from across the mill floor, and you got the feeling he was filing you away. Somewhere, making a judgment he had no intention of sharing. He wasn't unfriendly. He was contained. He paused. Earl was different. Earl was warmer, more talkative. But Earl had something his father had too, underneath the warmth. A watchfulness. An understanding that some things stayed in the family. Did you ever notice anything unusual about the mill? Physically, things that seemed out of place. Vernon looked at her steadily. There was a section of the south ground floor that Earl asked us to stay away from. Not formally, not with a sign or a specific instruction. But if you were working near that end of the room, he'd find a reason to move you somewhere else. Efficient about it. Natural seeming. I noticed because I noticed things. I never said anything. He picked up his coffee mug. I've thought about it since, over the years. Why that section? I never found an answer that fully satisfied me. You will now, Nora said. She told him about the mortar seams and the 1947 permit in the same careful language she'd used before, and this time, she added what Marcus had found about the gold prices and the Depression-era conversion of assets. She watched Vernon Cade's face as she talked. There was a story, he said, when she finished. The kind of story that circulates in small towns for decades and nobody's quite sure if it started in fact or in someone's imagination. The story was that the Whitmore family had money that wasn't in any bank, had converted it to something solid during the banking panics of the 30s, something they could put their hands on. Nobody ever knew for certain. Harold didn't talk about his finances with his workers, which was sensible. Earl certainly didn't. But the mill did very well through the Depression, which was unusual. And Harold always paid in cash, which in itself wasn't unusual in that era, but combined with everything else made people wonder. He looked at her over his coffee mug. You found something in that building. I found a room that's been sealed since at least 1947, she said, with reinforced flooring. Vernon set down his mug. Well, he said. He said it quietly, in a tone that was not surprised and was not unsurprised and contained decades of accumulated patience. Well. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his kitchen table. Then he looked up. Earl never married, he said. Never had children. He had the mill, and he had the secret. If there was a secret, and I imagine carrying both of those alone for 30 years after his father died was a weight that got heavier, not lighter. Some people are made to carry weight. Some people carry it long past the point where it helps them. He paused. When he locked up and left in 1978, I was the last person he talked to at the mill. He shook my hand. He said he was sorry to be leaving. He didn't say why he was leaving, and I didn't ask, because his face told me the asking would not be welcomed. Vernon folded his hands on the table. I always thought he was protecting something. I just didn't know what. Now you do, she said. Vernon looked at her with the steady eyes of a man who had waited 81 years for an answer to a question he'd been carrying for 50. Now I do, he said softly. She drove back to the mill with Vernon's words sitting beside her in the car with the weight of possible things, the particular heaviness of information that has not yet been confirmed but that changes the quality of everything you look at. The 1947 permit for reinforced flooring. Harold Whitmore, who'd come through the Depression with his mill intact when others hadn't. Money that wasn't in any bank. Something solid. Something you could put your hands on. She needed to open the wall. Not carelessly, not destructively, but she needed to see what was on the other side of it. The time for research and patience and building her understanding incrementally had passed the moment Vernon Cade said what he'd said in his kitchen on Route 8. Whatever was behind that sealed room was there, or it wasn't, and the only way to know was to look. She found Marcus at the cottage table with his school laptop open, a page of notes beside it. He'd been researching, the way he researched things, systematically, leaving a trail of sources she could follow if she needed to. What do you have? She asked. He turned the laptop toward her. Gold prices. 1947 was the last year before the Bretton Woods Agreement fully took effect. The fixed price was $35 an ounce. If the Whitmores had converted significant assets to gold during the 1930s or early 1940s, a substantial amount of bullion could have been accumulated. How substantial? Depends on how much money they had. The mill did strong business for decades. He looked at her. Gold is currently trading at around $2,300 an ounce. She sat down across from him. If they had gold bullion from the 1930s or 1940s that hadn't been touched since, the appreciation alone would be extraordinary, he said. 100 pounds of gold in 1940 at about $35 an ounce would have been worth roughly $56,000. That same 100 pounds today, at current prices, would be worth roughly $3.7 million. They sat with that number for a moment. We don't know there's gold, she said. No, he said. We don't. We don't know there's anything. No. He looked at the laptop screen. We don't know until we open the wall. She bought masonry tools from the hardware store that afternoon, spending $47 on a cold chisel, a masonry hammer, a pry bar, and safety glasses, which left her with $11. Doris didn't ask what she was doing with them, but her eyes tracked the purchase with the attentiveness of a woman who had been paying careful attention to the new owner of the Whitmore mill since she'd walked in 3 weeks ago. She read 3 articles on her phone about the correct way to open a mortared stone wall without destabilizing the surrounding structure. The technique was straightforward in principle. Work the mortar joints, not the stones themselves. Remove the mortar in sections rather than all at once. Use the cold chisel to cut rather than the hammer to break. The stones, once mortared, were not going anywhere on their own. It was the mortar that needed to be removed carefully, joint by joint, until the stones could be lifted free. She planned to open a section large enough to look through before removing more material. A foot wide, 18 inches tall, at eye level. Enough to see what was on the other side without committing to a full opening before she understood what she was dealing with. That night she told the kids what she was going to do in the morning. Not the full weight of what Vernon Cade had implied, not the number Marcus had calculated, but the practical fact. Tomorrow they were going to carefully open a section of the sealed wall and see what was behind it. Lily, who had been patient about being excluded from the mill exploration for 3 weeks, said she was coming. She said it with the finality of someone 9 years old who has decided the time for exclusion has passed. Nora looked at her daughter's face and thought about what it meant to bring a 9-year-old to look at the inside of a wall that might contain nothing and might contain something that would change everything. And she said, "Yes, you're coming." The morning was clear and very cold. They walked to the mill as the sun was still low, their breath visible in the still air, their feet leaving prints in the thin frost on the grass. Nora carried the tool bag. Marcus carried the flashlights and a lantern they'd bought at the dollar store. Lily walked between them, quiet and serious, wearing the winter coat that was one size too small and the rubber boots that were one size too big, and looking, as she often did, like someone who had decided not to let the facts of her situation slow her down. The mill door opened with the familiar resistance of old hinges, and the smell of stone and old wood came out to meet them. Marcus set the lantern on the desk in the corner and lit it, and the ground floor filled with a warm yellow light that made the space look more intentional than it usually did in the gray natural light from the boarded windows. In that light, the milling equipment cast long shadows, the millstones patient and still, the iron gears sealed in their rust. Nora set her bag down in front of the sealed section of the south wall. She had marked the mortar joints she intended to open, 2 horizontal lines and 2 vertical ones, outlining the foot-wide, 18-inch tall section she'd planned the night before. She looked at her marks. She looked at the wall. She looked at her children standing behind her, Marcus with his hands in his pockets, Lily with her hands clasped in front of her with a seriousness that made her look about 40 years old. She picked up the cold chisel and the masonry hammer. "Stay back," she said. "There'll be dust." She began at the top horizontal joint of her marked section, working the chisel into the mortar seam and striking it with careful measured blows. The mortar was hard, but not as hard as the original construction mortar, and it gave to the chisel in small increments, crumbling rather than shattering, releasing a fine pale dust that floated in the lantern light. She worked methodically along the top seam, then the left vertical, then the right, then the bottom, removing mortar in stages rather than trying to clear the whole section at once. Her arms ached from the work, but she found a rhythm in it, the rhythm of physical labor that asks only for attention and not for thought, and she was grateful for that, for the way the hammer in her hand and the chisel in the joint kept her from running too far ahead of what she actually knew. The work took 40 minutes. It was physical and precise and demanded more focus than she'd expected, not because it was technically difficult, but because the alternative to focus was thinking about what might be on the other side of the stone she was freeing, and thinking about that while holding a hammer would not have served anyone. When the joints were clear enough, she used the pry bar at the base of the lowest stone in her marked section, a block about 18 inches long and 8 inches tall. It moved. Not easily, not without effort, but it moved, shifting in its cleared socket with a grinding sound that seemed very loud in the silence of the building, and then came free, and Marcus stepped forward without being asked and took it from her because it was heavy, and she had a gap. A foot wide, 8 inches tall, dark on the other side. She took a flashlight and lay flat on the mill floor and put her head and the flashlight into the gap. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The beam of the flashlight cut into the dark on the other side of the wall, and she saw a room. It was not a large room, maybe 15 feet wide, maybe 12 feet deep, with stone walls on 3 sides, and the wall she'd just opened on the 4th. The ceiling was the same heavy timber and stone as the main room, the same height. The floor was solid stone, the same limestone as the rest of the building's foundation. And the floor was not empty. She moved the flashlight slowly across the space. In the center of the room, occupying most of its floor area, was a structure she had to look at for several seconds before she fully understood what she was seeing. It was built into the floor itself, a frame of iron, set into the stone, forming a rectangle approximately 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, and within the frame, flush with the stone floor, was a door. An iron door, massive and old, its surface dark with oxidation, hinged on one side, and fitted with what appeared to be a locking mechanism on the other. Beneath the floor, a vault beneath the floor. She pulled her head out of the gap. She sat up on the mill floor with her back against the south wall and looked at her children. Marcus was watching her face. "What's there?" he said. She told him. She described what she'd seen in the careful language of someone who was trying very hard to be accurate and not to impose a meaning on something before she'd fully confirmed it. The room, the floor, the iron frame in the stone, the door. "A vault," Marcus said. "Something built into the floor," she said. "I don't know what's in it." Lily sat down cross-legged on the mill floor and looked at her mother with the unsettling directness she sometimes deployed. "Mama," she said, "is it treasure?" Nora looked at her daughter for a moment. 9 years old, sitting on a dusty mill floor in her too small coat and too big boots, asking the question with the directness that only a 9-year-old could bring to it. "I don't know yet," Nora said. "Let's find out." She went back to the wall. She worked for another hour, removing stones from the sealed section one by one, widening the opening until it was large enough for an adult to pass through without contorting. The stones she set carefully to the side, each one placed flat, preserving the material. Marcus helped her lift the heavier blocks. Lily carried the smaller ones to the corner with the desk and stacked them neatly, which was perhaps not the most critical job, but which she performed with the same focused seriousness she'd been applying since they arrived. When the opening was wide enough, Nora went through first. The sealed room was cold, colder than the main room by several degrees, the cold of a sealed space, still air that had been sitting in its own specific temperature for decades. It smelled like stone and age and a faint undercurrent of something metallic that she felt in the back of her nose more than smelled in any clear way. She moved the flashlight carefully around the walls. They were plain limestone, no carvings, no features, no windows, which explained the exterior wall. There had never been a window in this room's walls because the room did not need natural light. It had been built for a different purpose entirely. On the north wall, at a height of about 4 feet, she could see where the original opening had been, the arch of the old doorway that connected this room to the main room, now filled with the stones she'd just removed. And in the floor, exactly as she'd seen through the gap, the iron vault. She crouched beside it and examined the frame. It was set into channels cut in the limestone floor with a precision that spoke of professional installation, not improvised construction. The iron was old and pitted with surface corrosion, but structurally solid when she pressed her gloved hand against it. The door was perhaps 3 inches thick, iron through and through, with 3 hinges on the left side, and a locking mechanism on the right that consisted of a heavy iron lever engaged with a recessed bolt. No padlock, no combination, just the lever. She looked at it for a moment. Then she gripped the lever with both hands and lifted. It moved. The mechanism had not seized in the way that machinery seizes when it has been in use for decades. It had been built well, built to last, and it had lasted. The lever came up and the bolt disengaged with a sound that was almost a click, almost inaudible in the room's cold stillness, and she pulled the door open. It swung on its hinges with a low resonance, the sound of heavy iron moving through air that had been still for a very long time. She looked into the vault. The space below the door was perhaps 4 feet deep, carved directly into the bedrock beneath the mill's limestone foundation, and it was not empty. She had to shine the flashlight directly into it and look for several seconds before she could fully process what she was seeing, because what she was seeing was not a thing she had a prior reference for, not in a context like this, not in a place like this, not attached to a life like hers. Gold. Not coins, though there were coins. Not jewelry, though there were small cases that might have contained jewelry. Primarily, overwhelmingly, gold bars. Rectangular ingots stacked in rows at the base of the vault, each one approximately the size of a thick paperback book, each one stamped with marks she could not yet read. Stack after stack of them, filling the lower portion of the vault to a depth of about 2 feet, the bars closest to the door dark with tarnish and the ones below them gleaming when her flashlight beam reached them directly, that distinctive color that had no equivalent in any other material. Not yellow and not orange, but something between them that was specific and unmistakable. Above the bars, resting on wooden shelves that had been built inside the vault's walls, were other items. Canvas bags sealed with wire, wooden boxes with latched lids, several leather document cases, a metal lockbox that had its own smaller locking mechanism. She knelt at the edge of the vault opening and did not touch anything for a long moment. She just looked. She thought about Harold Whitmore, who had filed a permit in 1947 for reinforced flooring in the southeast section of the ground floor, who had run the mill through the Depression when others couldn't, who had paid his workers in cash, who had converted his assets to something solid, something he could put his hands on. She thought about the floor that needed to be reinforced, and why a floor would need to be reinforced, and now she knew. The vault was cut into bedrock, but the floor around it was limestone set over a shallow foundation. And if you were going to put this much weight on a limestone floor, you would reinforce it first, because otherwise the floor would eventually crack under the load. Harold Whitmore had made a 1947 permit application for reinforced flooring, which was true, and he had used the same project to seal the room and install the vault and fill it with whatever was in it. And the mundane bureaucratic language of the permit had hidden in plain sight for 77 years. She thought about Earl Whitmore, who had inherited this building and presumably known what was in it, or had found it the way she had found it, through observation and careful attention, who had kept it sealed and secret for 30 years after he took over from his father, and then in 1978 had locked every door and driven away, because perhaps keeping a secret of this size had become something he could no longer manage, or something he feared, or something he didn't know what to do with, or all of those things together, who had died in 2004 without telling anyone and left the county to inherit a building containing something the county had never known was there. She reached into the vault and lifted one of the gold bars. The weight of it went through her immediately, the specific dense heaviness of gold, heavier than any material of that size should be, heavier than reason seemed to account for. She turned it in her hands. The stamp on the face read, Assay Office, San Francisco, California. Fine gold. For 100 OZT. Below that, a series of numbers, an assay number, and a date. 1934. 1934. Made in 1934, during the depths of the Depression, at a time when private ownership of gold was being legally restricted across the United States. Bars like this, in private hands rather than government vaults, had existed in that period, but their possession had required both resources and a particular willingness to operate outside the systems that most people navigated within. She set the bar aside and examined the wooden boxes on the shelves above the bars. She opened the nearest one. Inside, packed in rows with old felt, were gold coins. American Eagles and St. Gaudens double eagles, $20 gold pieces, their faces worn smooth in some cases from handling, but their metal intact, still brilliant where the felt had protected them. She counted 42 coins in this box alone. She opened a second box. British sovereigns, 80 of them in 4 rows, their lion faces looking up from the felt. She opened one of the leather document cases carefully. Inside was a sheaf of papers, their edges brown with age. The top one a certificate bearing a formal institutional letterhead, a gold seal, and a date of 1938, with a number on it that had many digits. Harold Whitmore had been careful. He had been very, very careful. She set the bar down and stood up and went to the opening in the wall and said, in the direction of the main room where her children were waiting, "Come through." Marcus came first, his eyes adjusting to the dimmer light of the sealed room, and then Lily behind him, small and careful, stepping through the gap in the wall with her hands out for balance. They came to stand beside her at the edge of the open vault, and they looked into it. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Lily, 9 years old, crouched down and looked at the gold bars stacked below and said in a perfectly ordinary voice, "There are a lot of them." "Yes," Nora said. "Are they real?" "I think so." "How do you know?" "Because one of them is very heavy and it has a government stamp on it from 1934. She picked up the bar she'd set aside and held it out so Lily could feel the weight. Lily took it in both hands and immediately lowered it back to the floor. "It's so heavy," Lily said. "That's what gold does," Nora said. "It's denser than it looks." Marcus had been quiet since he'd come into the room. He was standing with his flashlight beam moving carefully across the contents of the vault, counting the rows of bars, looking at the wooden boxes and leather cases on the shelves, not touching anything. He had his phone in his hand and had been calculating something. "The bars visible in the lower section," he said, his voice careful and controlled in a way that told her he was working very hard to keep it that way. "I can count approximately 40 rows of 10, 400 bars visible from this angle, and there might be more beneath those. At 400 troy ounces per bar and current gold prices," he stopped. He looked at the number on his phone. He looked at his mother. "How much?" she said. He said a number. She made him say it again. He did. She sat down on the cold stone floor of the sealed room, not because she decided to sit down, but because sitting down was what her body did. She sat on the stone in the cold and dark and looked at the vault full of gold and felt the number settle into her in stages, the way very large things settle, in waves of comprehension, each wave a little larger than the last. 400 gold bars visible. $41 million at minimum. Probably more, accounting for the additional bars that might be beneath the visible rows and the contents of the wooden boxes and the leather cases and the metal lockbox. Possibly significantly more. Possibly much more. "We can't be sure of the count," she said, because the practical part of her brain, the part that had kept her moving through 11 weeks of parking lots and wait lists, was still working and was not going to stop working just because she was sitting on a stone floor, looking at gold. "No," Marcus said. "We can't. And we don't know what's in the boxes and the cases. No, we need a professional. Someone who can assess this properly, catalog it, tell us what we actually have." "An appraiser," Marcus said. "Or several. We need to know what the bars are worth, what the coins are worth if there are coins in those bags, what any documents in the cases might represent." She stood up. Her legs felt slightly unreliable, which was a physical fact she noted and set aside. "And we need to know what the legal situation is. What ownership of a vault full of gold buried in the floor of a building you bought at county auction actually means." "It was in the building when you bought it," Marcus said. "I know. You bought the building. I know. Which means I know," she said. And she did know. And she was not ready to say it out loud yet. Not until a lawyer had confirmed it. Not until an appraiser had put a number on what was in this vault that was a real number and not a calculation made by a 14-year-old boy on a phone in the cold. She was not going to let herself believe the size of this until the size of this had been confirmed by people who knew what they were talking about. She reached down and picked up the gold bar from the floor. 400 troy ounces. A date from 1934. A government essay stamp. She carried it with her when she climbed back through the opening into the main room. She put it in her bag, wrapped in her spare sweater, heavy against her side, and she said to her children, "We don't tell anyone about this yet. Not Brenda, not Doris, not anyone. We need to handle this correctly." Marcus nodded immediately. Lily looked at the bag where the bar was wrapped in the sweater. "How do we handle it correctly?" she asked. "We find a lawyer," Nora said. "And then we find someone who knows what gold is worth. And then we go from there." "Today?" Lily asked. Nora looked at her daughter, at the too small coat and the too big boots and the face that had not complained once in 3 months. Not through the car, and the parking lot, and the buy-nothing mattress and the yellow curtains pinned up at the hem. The face that had asked simply and directly, "Is it treasure?" "Today," Nora said. They locked the mill door and walked back across the frozen grass to the cottage. Nora carried the bag with the gold bar against her side and felt the weight of it with every step, the dense, specific gravity of it, the way it pulled at her shoulder. She'd been carrying weight of a different kind for months, and this weight was nothing like that weight. But her body did not know the difference yet and registered it the same way. As something real, something that had to be moved through space and could not be set down. At the cottage, she sat at the kitchen table and opened her laptop and began looking for lawyers. Not the kind who handled divorces and small claims and tenant disputes, the kind she'd dealt with before. The kind who handled estates and property law and asset recovery. The kind who had dealt with situations that were outside the ordinary run of things. She didn't know how to find that kind of lawyer from a kitchen table in Alderton Township with $11 in her checking account. But she had learned over the past months that not knowing how to do something was a starting point, not an ending. She looked for 40 minutes. She found 3 names. 2 were in Philadelphia, 1 in Lancaster. She read their firm websites and their case histories and the things they said about themselves in the careful way lawyers say things, full of qualifications and professional distance, and she read between those lines for the thing she actually needed, which was someone who would take her seriously. She called the one in Lancaster first, got a receptionist, explained in careful, specific terms that she had purchased a property at county auction that contained assets of significant value, and that she needed legal counsel on the question of ownership and proper procedure. The receptionist put her through to a paralegal. She told the story again, the same careful, specific language, and at the end of it said she needed someone who could come out to the property to assess the situation. There was a pause on the other end. "Can you describe the nature of the assets?" the paralegal asked. Nora looked at the bag on the table beside her laptop, at the lump of the gold bar wrapped in her sweater. She had weighed it on the kitchen scale when she'd gotten back, the small digital scale she used for recipes when she still had recipes to make. 27 pounds. A single bar. 27 pounds. "Gold bullion," she said. "Stored in a vault beneath the floor of a stone mill building that I purchased at Alderton Township County Auction 6 weeks ago. I don't have a precise valuation yet, but I believe the amount may be substantial." Another pause. Longer this time. "Ms. Callahan," the paralegal said, and her voice had shifted, acquired a different quality of attention, the quality that came with realizing a call had turned into something else entirely. "I'm going to transfer you to one of our partners directly. Can you hold for a moment?" "Yes," Nora said. "I can hold." She sat at the kitchen table with the phone pressed to her ear and looked across the room at her children, at Marcus sitting at the counter with his hands flat on the surface, and his face doing the same calculation she imagined her own face was doing, trying to hold the information steady while the world rearranged itself around it. At Lily, who had picked up one of her 5 books and was sitting on the floor reading it with the composed readiness of someone who understood that the important things would happen when they happened, and that reading was a sensible activity in the meantime. The whole music played. She counted 62 seconds of it. Then a different voice came on the line, male, senior, carrying the authority of someone for whom legal complexity was an ordinary workday. "Miss Callahan," the voice said. "My name is Gerald Marsh. I understand you've made a discovery." "I have," Nora said. "Tell me everything," he said. "From the beginning. Leave nothing out." She closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about the property auction listing she'd found at midnight in a Sunoco parking lot. She thought about the bid she'd submitted with almost the last money she had. She thought about Marcus saying that's a ruin and her answering it has a cottage, and that being the whole logic of it, the entire chain of reasoning compressed into 6 words. She thought about the frost on the inside of the windshield and the peanuts eaten one at a time, and the drive to a building in Alderton Township that nobody wanted, and $8.42 in a bank account. She thought about a man named Harold Whitmore who had been careful, who had been very, very careful, who had converted his wealth to something solid and buried it in the floor of a stone building and sealed it behind a wall and trusted that the building would hold, which it had, for 77 years, until a woman who had run out of other options bought it for $350 and looked at it carefully enough to see what everyone else had missed. She opened her eyes. "From the beginning," she said. "All right." She began. Outside, the winter sun moved across the Pennsylvania sky with its usual indifference to human events. The mill stood in its field the way it had stood for 113 years, limestone and patience and time, its south wall intact, the opening she'd made in it a gap that would be the first thing she'd have a professional secure before anyone else came near the property. The lantern she'd left burning in the sealed room would run out of fuel by evening, and when it did, the vault would be dark again, dark the way it had been dark for 77 years, though not for much longer now. Gerald Marsh listened for 22 minutes without interrupting. Then he said, "Miss Callahan, I need to come out there. I need to see this in person before I give you any formal counsel. Are you available tomorrow morning?" "Yes," she said. "And you haven't told anyone else about this?" "No one. Keep it that way until I've had a chance to review the situation." A pause. "I've been practicing property law for 31 years. I want you to understand that what you're describing, if accurate, is a situation I have not encountered in 31 years of practice." Nora looked at the bag on the table. 27 pounds of gold. 1 bar. There were hundreds more in the vault below the sealed room, and wooden boxes of coins and document cases, and a metal lockbox with its own lock, and she did not yet know what any of it added up to in a real number, a confirmed number, a number that a professional had verified. "I understand," she said. "Get some sleep, Miss Callahan. Tomorrow we'll start figuring out what you actually have." She thanked him and ended the call and set the phone down on the kitchen table and sat for a moment in the quiet of the cottage kitchen. Marcus looked at her. "Tomorrow," she said. "A lawyer is coming tomorrow." He nodded slowly. He looked at the bag with the gold bar inside. "Are you scared?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "I don't know what I am," she said. "I think I'll know more tomorrow." She got up and made dinner from what they had, which was pasta and a jar of tomato sauce and some cheese, and they ate at the kitchen table the way they ate every night. And she helped Lily with her reading homework, and Marcus finished an essay for school that was due Friday. And the evening was ordinary in all the ways evenings are ordinary, and also unlike any other evening any of them had ever had. When the kids were asleep, Nora sat on the front step of the cottage in the cold and looked at the mill building rising dark against the night sky. The limestone walls were pale in the moonlight, old and solid, the same walls that had been standing since 1911. She thought about what Brenda would say. She thought about the shelter wait list she was still on, technically, having never called to remove her name. She thought about the orthodontist bill and the alternator and the $400 a month the new landlord had wanted, all the small and ordinary catastrophes that had added up to a parking lot in December. She had spent $350. She had bought something nobody wanted. She had looked carefully. The mill said nothing. It was a building. It had been keeping its secret for 77 years, and it had no feelings about the matter. But Nora sat on the front step of the cottage in the cold Pennsylvania night and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the world was not finished with her yet, that the things she'd lost were not the last word, that there was more on the other side of the sealed walls that kept appearing in her life, more than she'd been able to see from where she'd been standing, and that looking carefully and refusing to stop was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the only thing that had ever worked. Gerald Marsh arrived at 9:17 in the morning in a dark blue sedan that looked precisely like the car a Lancaster property attorney would drive, which is to say it was clean and late model and gave no information about the person inside it beyond the fact that they were doing well enough to buy a clean, late model sedan. He was in his early 60s, compact, with silver hair cut short and reading glasses on a cord around his neck and a briefcase he carried with the ease of someone who had been carrying briefcases for 30 years and no longer thought about it. He shook Nora's hand in the driveway with the careful courtesy of a man who had taken this call seriously from the moment he'd gotten on the line the night before and was now here in person to determine what exactly he had taken seriously. He looked at the mill. Built in 1911, Nora said. I read the records last night, he said, before I drove out. He looked at the building for another moment. The limestone walls, the trees grown close, the pigeon colony in the gap of the fourth-floor roof. Let's see what you found. She took him through the main door and across the ground floor to the south wall and showed him the opening she'd made, the stones stacked neatly to the side, the dark gap leading into the sealed room. She showed him the sealed room and the vault in the floor and the gold bars and the wooden boxes of coins and the leather document cases. She showed him the 1934 assay stamp on a bar she lifted from the top row and held out to him. He took it in both hands. His expression did not change in any dramatic way, but something behind his eyes shifted, the subtle recalibration of a man encountering a situation that is significantly outside his working norms. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. He set the bar down carefully and looked at the vault for a long moment without speaking. Then he took out his phone and made a call. He spoke to someone named Arthur, who turned out to be Arthur Heine, a precious metals specialist and certified appraiser based in Philadelphia, who drove out to the mill that same afternoon in a van with equipment cases in the back, and the specific, focused manner of someone who had been told something extraordinary over the phone and was here to either confirm it or debunk it. He was in his 50s, bearded, wearing the practical clothes of someone who worked with his hands in ways that required thinking more than the clothes would suggest. Arthur looked at the first gold bar for approximately 4 seconds before he reached into his case for testing equipment. He tested for 2 hours. The instruments he used were portable and precise, spectrographic tools and density measurement devices that confirmed each bar's composition with a margin of error small enough to make doubt impractical. He tested bars from 4 different positions in the stack, top and bottom and both sides, and they came back the same each time. Fine gold, 999. 9 purity, exactly as the 1934 assay stamp represented. He counted the bars visible in the vault's lower section, photographing each row from multiple angles, building a photographic record that would hold up to any legal scrutiny. He opened the wooden boxes and documented the coins, sorting them by type and period and condition with the unhurried precision of a man who had learned that speed was the enemy of accuracy in this work, and that accuracy was the only thing that mattered. He examined the leather document cases with the focused deliberation of someone reading what the documents were while also reading what they meant, which were not the same reading. He opened the metal lockbox with a small pry bar and found inside the gold certificates and what appeared to be a collection of rare numismatic items. He picked one up and held it to the lantern light that Marcus was holding steady at his shoulder. He was quiet for a moment. Is that one significant? Marcus asked. This is an 1804 draped bust dollar, Arthur said, turning the coin with the reverence of someone handling something genuinely irreplaceable. Approximately 15 known examples. Your Harold Whitmore understood what he was collecting. He set it down with the care of a man lowering something into still water and moved on. Nora stood near the opening in the south wall and watched him work and did not ask questions. Gerald Marsh stood beside her making notes on a legal pad. Marcus sat on the stone floor in the corner, out of the way, watching with the attention he brought to things that mattered. Lily, after an hour of sitting quietly, had gone back to the main room and was sitting at the old desk drawing in her notebook. When Arthur was done, he came to stand in front of Nora with his hands folded in front of him, and the expression on his face was the expression of a professional delivering information he knows will land with force and who is choosing to deliver it evenly. The gold bars are genuine, he said. San Francisco Assay Office, 1934 and 1936 production. Standard 400 troy-ounce commercial bars, which at current prices run approximately $920,000 apiece. He paused. I count 412 bars visible in the primary vault storage. There may be additional bars beneath the visible rows, which I would need to fully excavate the vault to confirm. At current spot prices, the visible bars alone represent approximately $379 million. Nobody said anything. The coins, he continued, are a mixture of American double eagles and British sovereigns, with a smaller collection of what appear to be pre-Civil War American gold coins in the lockbox. In terms of numismatic value, the pre-Civil War pieces are particularly significant. A full cataloging is needed, but my preliminary estimate for the coin collection is somewhere in the range of $12 to $18 million, depending on condition assessment. He paused again. The document cases contain a mix of materials. Several of the certificates are gold-backed financial instruments from the late 1930s that were issued by Swiss banking institutions. They bear serial numbers that would need to be verified with the issuing institutions, some of which still exist. The face value of these instruments, adjusted for the gold backing and the time elapsed, potentially represents an additional $30 to $40 million. Potentially significantly more if the instruments have accrued any benefit under the terms under which they were issued. Gerald Marsh had stopped writing on his legal pad. He was looking at Arthur. The total, Arthur said, is not something I can give you with precision today. A full appraisal will take time. But my working estimate, based on what I've examined this afternoon, is in the range of $430 to $450 million. He said the number the way he said everything else, evenly, professionally, without inflection, as if numbers of this size were part of his ordinary working vocabulary, which for him they were. For Nora they were not. She sat down on the stone floor of the sealed room, the same way she'd sat down when Marcus had said his number on his phone the morning before. Her body made the decision before she did. She sat on the cold stone and looked at the vault full of gold bars in their rows, and felt the number move through her in the way that numbers of impossible size move through a person, slowly, incompletely, the mind accepting one digit at a time before it can hold the whole thing. $430 million. She had spent 350 of them. Gerald Marsh was the first person to speak. "Miss Callahan," he said, in the measured tone of a lawyer who had been thinking about legal implications for the past 2 hours while an appraiser counted gold bars. "I want to address the question of ownership directly, because it's the most important legal question here, and I want you to have clarity before anything else proceeds." She looked up at him. Under Pennsylvania property law, assets found within the structure of a property belong to the owner of the property, not to prior owners or to the state, with certain limited exceptions. The gold and associated assets were clearly stored in the mill prior to your acquisition, but they were contained within the building structure, specifically within a vault built into the foundation. The county tax lien auction transferred title to the property and its improvements and contents to you. He paused. There will be tax implications. There will be reporting requirements. There will be a process. But the assets are yours, Miss Callahan. The assets are yours. She said nothing. She did not trust herself to speak, and she understood that in this moment, with a lawyer and an appraiser in a sealed room beneath a Pennsylvania mill in winter, silence was acceptable. Marcus had been quiet in his corner. He stood up now and crossed to where she was sitting and crouched down beside her, and she felt his hand on her shoulder, and she put her hand over his, and they stayed like that for a moment in the cold of the sealed room while the gold bars sat in their rows, and the vault door leaned open on its hinges, and the lantern threw its yellow light across everything. "Mom," he said quietly. She nodded. "You did it," he said. She shook her head. "We found it," she said. "That's different." The process that began that afternoon was neither fast nor simple, which was something Gerald Marsh had warned her about, and which turned out to be true in ways that went beyond what any warning could have fully prepared her for. There were federal reporting requirements for assets of this scale. There were state notifications. There were tax assessments, which Gerald handled with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood that the difference between a tax assessment managed properly and one managed carelessly was the difference between keeping most of what you found and keeping considerably less. Arthur Heine came back with a team to fully excavate the vault and complete the catalog. They found, beneath the visible rows of bars, an additional 61 bars that had been placed in a lower tier, resting in channels cut in the vault's bedrock floor. 473 bars in total. And on the bedrock floor of the vault itself, beneath the lowest bars, a leather-wrapped bundle containing a handwritten letter. The letter was from Harold Whitmore, dated October 1947. The paper was fragile and the ink had faded, but it was legible, and what it said, in the careful formal prose of a man who had composed his thoughts over a very long time before committing them to paper, was this: that he had spent 40 years building the mill and the fortune it represented into something that would outlast him, something that could not be taken from the family by banking failures or economic panics or the instabilities of paper money. That he had placed what he valued in the ground beneath the mill because the ground was more reliable than the systems men built above it. That he was writing this letter for whoever found the vault, whether family or stranger, because he wanted the purpose behind it understood, not greed, but preservation, the deep Scots-Irish stubbornness of a man who had watched his neighbors lose everything in the 1930s and had made a decision that he would not. The letter ended. The mill provided this. Let it provide again, for whoever needs it most. Nora read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her bag and took it back to the cottage and kept it. She called Brenda that evening. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The phone rang 4 times before Brenda answered, which was unusual. Brenda almost always answered on the second ring. "Nora," she said, in the voice of someone who has been half expecting this call all day. "I heard something on the county assessor's social media page about an appraisal team at the Whitmore mill." Small towns. Nora had known this would happen. The county assessor's office had posted something vague about an unusual property matter in Alderton Township, and small towns had their own social media ecosystems in the same way they had their own weather. "I was going to call you," Nora said. "Is it true? What people are saying?" "What are people saying?" "That you found something. Something significant." A pause. "Nora, is it true?" Nora looked at the kitchen table, at the copy of Harold Whitmore's letter sheet set there, at the coffee mug beside it, at the window with the yellow curtains pinned at the hem because she hadn't gotten around to sewing them, and now perhaps she never would have to pin them again. "It's true," she said. A long silence. "How much?" Brenda asked, very quietly. Nora told her the number. The silence that followed was so long that she checked her phone to see if the call had dropped. "Brenda," she said. A sound from Brenda's end, not quite a word, not quite a sob, somewhere in the space between them. "I need you to listen to me," Nora said. "Because there's something I need you to understand. You helped us. When we needed somewhere to go, you opened your door. I know it was hard. I know we were there too long, and you didn't know how to say so. I know you." She paused. "The notes about the dishes. That wasn't cruelty. That was you running out of room. I understand that. I always understood it." "Nora, I'm not angry," Nora said. "I want you to know that. I'm not calling to," she stopped. Started again. "I'm calling because you're my sister, and this happened, and you needed to hear it from me." Another long silence. Then Brenda said, in a voice Nora hadn't heard from her in years, the voice from when they were children, and something happened that was too big for either of them to hold alone. "You bought a ruin for $350. I know, and it had $400 million in it. More? Closer to 440, pinning the full assessment." "Nora." The word was not quite a question and not quite a statement, and contained, somehow, 30 years of sisterhood in 2 syllables. "I know," Nora said. And she did know. She knew all of it. Brenda drove out the next morning. She walked through the cottage and through the mill and stood at the opening in the south wall and looked at the sealed room and the vault, which was now fully excavated and documented, the bars arranged in their counted rows for the photograph archive that Arthur's team had been building. She stood there for a long time without speaking. Then she turned around and looked at Nora and said, "You are the most stubborn person I have ever known in my entire life." "Yes," Nora said. "You are absolutely infuriating." "I know." Brenda put her arms around her. Nora felt her sister trembling, felt the particular quality of it, the trembling of someone releasing something they'd been holding for a long time, and she held her back. The story became public 12 days later. Gerald Marsh had managed the disclosure process with the methodical care he brought to everything, coordinating the required notifications, managing the tax and legal documentation, ensuring that by the time the story reached anyone outside the necessary professional circle, the important legal questions had already been answered in Nora's favor. He had been practicing property law for 31 years, and he told her he had never encountered a situation quite like hers, which was the most a lawyer like Gerald was going to say about the extraordinary quality of anything he'd handled. The story, when it broke completely. The local Alderton paper ran it first, because small towns have reporters who still answer their phones, and a county assessor's social media post about an unusual property matter had been sitting in the back of the local reporter's mind for 2 weeks. The Philadelphia Inquirer picked it up within hours. By the following morning, it was national. By the morning after that, it had crossed the Atlantic. Homeless single mother buys abandoned mill at county auction for $350, finds $440 million in gold hidden since 1940s. The headline was not precisely accurate in its details, since she had not been technically homeless at the time of the auction. They'd been in the parking lot of a Sunoco station in Haverford County, which was a distinction most headlines weren't interested in. She had tried, in the first interview she agreed to explain the distinction, and the reporter had nodded and written single mother living in car, which was accurate, and which she decided not to argue with. The call started before breakfast. Nora's prepaid phone, $60 of credit left on it, was not built for what came through it in the first 48 hours. Television, documentary producers, a publisher, financial advisors who had obtained her number through means she declined to inquire about. Gerald fielded everything. That was what she paid him for, and she paid him well, and he earned it. She also received a call from a woman in Haverford County who had been on the shelter wait list when Nora had been on it. The woman had found her number through the shelter's records, which she should not have had access to, and she called to say she was still waiting, 8 weeks now, 2 kids, and she was sorry to bother her, but she didn't know who else to call. Nora talked to her for 20 minutes, and then called the shelter director and funded the 6 additional beds that afternoon without telling anyone except Gerald and the shelter director. It was not a gesture. It was a debt she recognized as belonging to her, the kind that comes due when you have been somewhere and now have the means to change it for someone still there. She drove into Alderton to see Doris. Doris was at the hardware store counter when Nora walked in, reading glasses on, and she looked up and her expression was the expression of someone who has been waiting for this visit and has been deciding what to say during the waiting. "I heard," Doris said. "I know you heard. $440 million. That's the working number. The final assessment isn't complete." Doris looked at her for a long moment. "Phil's assessment," she said. "The structural report. He told me to tell you to forget about paying him." "I'm not going to forget about it," Nora said. "He said you'd say that." "What did you tell him?" Doris almost smiled. "I told him she's a property owner now. Let her pay her bills." She took her glasses off. "You gave me your water sample form and I thought, here is a woman making a very bad decision. I thought that honestly. I thought it with kindness, but I thought it." "Everyone thought it," Nora said. "That's all right." "No," Doris said. "It's not all right. It means we looked at you and saw the situation and we didn't see you." She picked up a pen, turned it in her fingers. "You saw something the rest of us have been walking past for 40 years. I had a reason to look more carefully," Nora said. "When you're out of options, you look at things differently." Doris was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do with it?" Nora had been thinking about this for 12 days. She'd been thinking about it in the cottage at night after the kids were asleep, and in the car driving to Alderton, and during Gerald Marsh's phone calls, and in the sealed room, while Arthur's team did their work. She'd been thinking about it with the same methodical attention she'd brought to the water test and the structural assessment and the mortar seams. "I'm going to fix the mill," she said. "First. That's the first thing. It's going to take years, but the building's sound, and it has history, and it deserves to be used again." She paused. "And I'm going to pay Phil. And I'm going to pay you back for the water test." "The water test was $11, Doris said. $11 matters." Doris looked at her. "Yes," she said quietly. "It does." She went to see Vern and Kate on the same day, driving the 4 miles out to his white farmhouse on Route 8. He was in his yard when she pulled up, scraping the last of the winter's ice from his driveway with a long-handled scraper, methodical and slow. He stopped when he saw her car and waited. She got out, and they stood in his yard in the cold, and she told him what they'd found. All of it. The bars and the coins and the documents and Harold's letter. She told him what the letter said. Vernon listened with his hands on the handle of the ice scraper and his eyes on the bare trees at the edge of his property. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "Let it provide again," he said, repeating Harold's words from the letter. "For whoever needs it most." "Yes," Nora said. "Well," he said. "Old Harold." He said it in a tone that contained something complicated, something that was not quite grief and not quite satisfaction, and was perhaps simply the feeling of a very old man finally receiving the answer to a question he had waited 81 years to ask. He would have been glad of that, I think. To know it went to someone who needed it and knew what to do with it. I'm still figuring out what to do with it, she said honestly. You'll figure it out, Vernon said. He picked up the ice scraper and resumed work with the deliberate steadiness of a man who was not going to stop doing what he was doing simply because the world had shifted. You figured out everything else, didn't you? The first thing Nora did with the money, before any formal disbursement had been settled, before the tax assessment had been finalized, before any of the things that Gerald Marsh was managing had reached their conclusions, was make a list. She made it at the kitchen table in the cottage, at night, with a cup of tea and a notebook, the way she'd made every important list since she was old enough to understand that organizing things on paper kept them from becoming chaos in her head. She had been making lists for 3 years that were essentially the same list in different configurations. What was owed, what was needed, what could wait. The categories had not changed. The numbers in them were about 2. The first section was debts, which was shorter than she expected and longer than she wanted. The orthodontist bill for Marcus's braces, $2,800, the bill that had started the avalanche, the one she'd paid off the alternator before, and then the rent before, and then the job loss had made impossible to address. The 2 months of rent she'd been behind on when the landlord raised the prices, $1,400 she owed to a landlord she'd never particularly liked and was going to pay anyway, because owing things to people you didn't like was its own specific discomfort. The money Brenda had given her for groceries during their 3 weeks at the house, for $100 that Brenda had said was a gift, but that Nora was going to pay back, because accepting gifts from people who then sent notes about the dishes had always felt morally complicated. Fill the structural assessor. Doors for the water test, $11. The gas station owner on Route 12 who had let her run a tab for 2 weeks when she had $8 in her account and hadn't asked when she'd pay it back and hadn't mentioned it since. She paid every item on the first section list within 2 weeks of the first partial disbursement from the estate proceeding. She drove to the gas station on Route 12 in person and handed the owner an envelope. He opened it and looked at the money inside, and then looked at her and said she didn't have to do this. She said she did. He said it was $12, not $11. She'd miscalculated. She gave him another $1. The second section was the children. She wrote Marcus's college fund number down and looked at it for a while, and then wrote it down again because the first time her handwriting had been unsteady. The figure she wrote was not a gesture or a starting point. It was a number that made the question of how to pay for college cease to be a question, which was the specific thing she'd wanted to give him since the day the alternator broke and the money that should have gone to the orthodontist went to the car instead. She wrote Lily's fund, the same number, because they were not going to make their choices from different positions. They were going to make their choices, when the time came, from the same position of possibility, and that was the thing she had been trying to give them with insufficient resources for 3 years, and she had it now. She could give it now. And she wrote the number and sat with it and thought about Lily on the mill floor in the too small coat, asking whether it was treasure, and understood that the treasure had been many things before it was gold. The third section was the mill. She had spent the 12 days since the discovery meeting with architects and structural engineers and a historian who specialized in 19th century American industrial buildings. And what she had learned was that the Whitmore mill was worth saving and worth saving properly. Not converted into something unrecognizable, not stripped of its character to make it commercially manageable, but restored. The ground floor returned to operational condition as a working mill, small scale, modern in its mechanics, but honest in its character. The upper floors converted into event space for the kind of functions that people in rural Pennsylvania drove 40 minutes to find. The grain annex stabilized and opened as a small museum of the mill's history, because the mill had a history worth knowing, and Harold Whitmore's letter deserved a place on a wall where people could read it. The cottage she was keeping. She was going to fix the porch and replace the window frame, and eventually add a proper bedroom, so Marcus and Lily didn't have to share. She was not moving to Philadelphia. She was not buying something large and demonstrative and designed to show the world how far she'd come from a Sunoco parking lot in December. She was going to live in a stone cottage in Alderton Township, Pennsylvania, and run a mill, and be her children's mother in a house with a roof that belonged to her. Brenda said, when she told her this, "You could live anywhere." "I know," Nora said. "I live here." "Nora, Brenda, I found this thing because I was here. Because I looked carefully at something most people passed over. I'm not going somewhere else." Brenda was quiet for a moment. "You never change," she said. "Not when I'm right," Nora said. The restoration took 3 years, which was longer than she'd hoped and faster than she'd feared. She hired a preservation architect out of Philadelphia who had worked on old textile mills and iron furnaces and understood that the goal was not the appearance of the past, but the reality of it, or as much reality as honest craft could achieve with modern materials where the original ones were beyond recovery. The limestone walls needed pointing. The collapsed fourth-floor roof was rebuilt using timber cut from the same species of tree as the original framing, white oak, sourced from a sustainable forestry operation in central Pennsylvania. The millstones were cleaned and realigned and connected to a new mechanical drive, and the mill ground its first grain in 47 years on a cold morning in early March, a test run, just the 2 stones and a bag of local wheat, and the flour that came out was coarse and yellow and real. She kept the millstones turning 1 day a week for the remainder of the year, working with a local farmer who brought his heritage grain in a pickup truck and left with flour and an experience he described to everyone he knew for months afterward. By the end of the first year of operation, there were 4 farmers on a waiting list for milling days, and a local baker who had been driving to Lancaster for stone ground flour was driving to Alderton instead. The grain annex took longer and cost more than the main building, because the separated wall required more intervention than the original structural assessment had suggested, and because Nora decided partway through the process to expand the museum space to include the full history of the property, not just the Whitmore era but the pre-industrial use of the mill race and the geological history of the limestone itself. The historian she'd hired became a consultant and then a partner in the museum's development, and what they built together was a small but genuinely excellent institution, the kind that won a Regional Heritage Award in its second year of operation and brought school groups from 3 counties. Harold Whitmore's letter, conserved and mounted behind glass by a paper preservation specialist from the Smithsonian who had agreed to make the trip after Nora's call to the institution, was the first thing visitors saw when they walked through the museum door. The placard beside it said, in Nora's chosen words, "This is why it was built. This is why it survived. This is why it matters." The mill opened in its restored form 3.5 years after. Nora had first driven down Mill Race Road in a borrowed Honda Civic. The opening day was a Saturday in May, the kind of Pennsylvania spring day that justifies every winter that comes before it. And people came from Alderton and from the surrounding townships, and from Philadelphia, and one couple from Maryland who had read about the restoration in a preservation magazine and driven 3 hours to see it. On the opening day, Doris from the hardware store came with her brother-in-law, Phil, who looked at the restored structure with the expression of a structural engineer seeing a building he'd once assessed as compromised, standing sound and functional and properly done, which is a specific professional satisfaction he clearly did not attempt to suppress. Vernon Cade came, 82 years old and moving with a cane now, and stood in the ground floor of the mill and looked at the millstones and the machinery with the long quiet of someone who had worked in a place for 11 years and is seeing it alive again. He stood there for a while without saying anything. Then he said, to the room in general and no one in particular, "Old Earl would have liked this." Nora thought about that. She was not sure Earl Whitmore would have liked it, exactly. She thought Earl Whitmore had been carrying something too heavy for too long and might have simply been relieved that someone else was carrying it now, which was a different thing from liking. But she did not say so. "I hope so," she said. Brenda came. She walked through every room and said very little, which was unusual for Brenda, and at the end she said, "It's beautiful," in the voice she used when she meant something entirely and was not going to add to it because adding to it would diminish it. Marcus was there, home from Penn State for the weekend, taller than he'd been and carrying himself differently in the way that young people carry themselves differently when they've been somewhere that confirmed what they were capable of. He stood beside his mother during the opening ceremony and listened to the mayor of Alderton Township say things about historic preservation and community resilience. And at the end, when people were milling through the building with cups of cider the local farm stand had provided, he came to stand beside her at the south wall, at the doorway they'd opened together with a cold chisel on a winter morning. And he looked at it for a moment. "You know what's funny?" he said. "What?" "I came in through that opening. We all came in through it. But we made it." He looked at the archway, properly finished now, stone lintel and stone surround. "We made the door." She looked at it. "We did," she said. Lily stood near the museum entrance, greeting people with a seriousness and warmth that she'd had since she was 9, since she'd sat on a mill floor in a too-small coat and asked whether it was treasure. She was 12 now, and she knew the answer, and she knew it was not the simple answer, and she was old enough to hold the complexity of it. The official number, accounting for all bars cataloged, all coins assessed, all documents verified with their issuing institutions, was $442 million. The tax obligation on the find, which Gerald Marsh had been negotiating with the state and federal revenue authorities with the tenacity of a man who understood that the difference between adequate representation and excellent representation was measurable in hundreds of millions of dollars, came to slightly less than a third of the total. Significant. But Nora had paid debts for 3 years on earnings that were never quite enough, and she understood that paying a portion of what you had was not a catastrophe. It was the cost of having something to pay on. What remained, after taxes and attorney's fees and the initial disbursements she made in the first weeks, was more than she would spend in her lifetime. She understood this with the same precision she'd brought to every other number she'd calculated across the past 3 years, and the precision confirmed what she already knew. This was not a problem to be solved. This was a fact to be managed, thoughtfully, over a very long time. She established a foundation. Not immediately, not before she understood what she was doing, but within the first year, after she'd had time to think carefully about what she wanted it to do and how she wanted it to do it. The Whitmore Foundation, named for the family whose careful stubbornness had created the thing she'd found, focused on 2 areas: historic preservation of rural Pennsylvania industrial buildings, and emergency housing assistance for families in exactly the situation she'd been in. Families where the math stopped working in September and the options ran out in November. Families where the gap between manageable and crisis was smaller than anyone outside that gap could quite believe. She funded 6 shelter beds in Haverford County and 12 in Philadelphia. She looked at the wait list she'd been on and thought about the 10 weeks she'd spent in the queue while her children slept in a car, and she funded the operational costs of the shelter on Route 30 for 3 years, which reduced the wait list by half. She did not publicize any of it. She had not done any of it to be admired. She had done it because Harold Whitmore's letter had said, "Let it provide again, for whoever needs it most," and she knew who needed it most because she had been who needed it most, and that knowledge was not something she could set aside. It was not a burden. It was the thing that made the rest of it coherent, the through line that ran from a Sunoco parking lot to a stone mill to a foundation that paid heating bills and security deposits for families who were out of other options. It was the same story, told forward from a different point on the line. Nora stood in the ground floor of the Whitmore mill on the opening day and looked at the south wall, at the doorway they'd finished with a proper stone arch, connecting the main room to what had been the sealed room, which was now the museum entrance, the beginning of the story rather than the secret at the end of it. She had stood at that wall once with nothing and a cold chisel and looked at it until it gave her something to work with. She thought about the parking lot. She thought about the frost on the inside of the windshield and the peanuts eaten one at a time, and the prepaid phone with $60 of credit, and the bid she'd placed at 11:47 at night on a photograph of sagging limestone. The only bidder, the only person for whom $350 and a building nobody wanted had looked like the same thing instead of like 2 different problems. She thought about all the people who had seen that listing and looked away. She did not blame them. She had nearly looked away herself. She had sat in the dark, turning it over in her mind for a long time before she submitted the bid. The difference between looking away and bidding had not been courage, exactly. It had been the specific quality of attention that arrives when you are out of other options, when you cannot afford to overlook anything, when every stone and every wall is worth examining, because the alternative is not examining it, and not examining it has already cost you everything you had. She turned away from the south wall and looked at her children across the room. Marcus with his Penn State posture and his permanent attention. Lily near the museum door, 12 years old and serious in the way she'd always been. The gravity of someone born knowing that things required her full engagement to go right. She felt the particular weight of that moment, the weight of a day that had been earned by 3 years of days that were simply too hard, and the knowledge that those 3 years were not wasted, were not merely survived, but had built something in all 3 of them that the discovery alone could not have built. The mill provided, the way Harold had hoped it would, not because Nora was lucky, because she looked carefully. Because she was out of other choices and that had made her, in the specific way that necessity makes a person, exactly the right person to be standing in an abandoned mill in Alderton Township at the right moment, with the right kind of attention, to see what 77 years of silence had been keeping. Some people come into their lives through doors that open easily and were always meant for them. Nora Callahan had come into hers through a wall she opened herself, stone by stone, in the cold, with a borrowed hammer and $11 in her account and 2 children who were counting on her to find a way. She had found a way. She would go on finding ways. That was who she was. That was who she'd always been. Marcus finished high school with the orthodontist's work complete, his college application submitted, his braces finally off, his smile the smile of someone who had been through something difficult and come out the other side with the understanding that difficult things were survivable. He was accepted to 3 universities and chose a program in environmental engineering at Penn State, which he picked for the quality of the program and the proximity to home, which he had not asked for permission to consider home. He drove out on weekends sometimes and helped with the mill restoration, which took 3 years and occupied every Saturday she could spare. Lily grew up in the cottage with the yellow curtains, eventually properly hemmed, and the 5 books on the kitchen shelf that had become 40 books, and then 2 full shelves, and then a small bookcase Marcus had built in the corner of the main room as a birthday present for his sister's 11th birthday. Lily grew up knowing the story of how they'd gotten there, not as a fairy tale, not as proof that things always worked out, but as the specific story of what her mother had done, which was look carefully at something everyone else had walked past and refused to stop looking. Nora had told her, when she was old enough to understand it, the mill didn't find us. We found it. We found it because we had no other choice but to look, and when you have no other choice but to look, you see things that people with other choices miss. The mill opened in its restored form 3.5 years after Nora had first driven down Mill Race Road in a borrowed Honda Civic. The restoration was accurate and the woodwork was honest and the millstones were back in alignment, capable of grinding grain again, which they did, because a local farmer had contacted her during the construction to ask whether she intended to actually operate the mill or merely display it, and she'd said both, and they had a contract. The museum in the grain annex opened the same day. Harold Whitmore's letter, conserved and mounted behind glass, was the first thing visitors saw when they walked through the door. The placard beside it said, in Nora's chosen words, "This is why it was built. This is why it survived. This is why it matters." On the opening day, Doris from the hardware store came. Phil the structural engineer came, with his wife, who looked at the restored mill with the expression of someone recognizing something they doubted and being glad to have been wrong. Vernon Cade came, 82 years old and moving slowly with a cane but present, standing in the ground floor of the mill and looking at the millstones and the restored mechanisms with the particular expression of someone who had worked in a place and is seeing it restored to something close to what it was, which is not the same thing as seeing it as it was, but is the next best thing. Brenda came. She walked through every room and said very little, which was unusual for Brenda, and at the end she said, "It's beautiful," which was accurate. Marcus was there. Lily stood beside her mother during the opening and watched the people moving through the restored building with the clear-eyed attention she'd had since she was 9 years old, sitting on a mill floor in a too small coat, asking whether it was treasure. It had been treasure. It was still treasure, in the form of what it had become, a building that worked again, a history that was visible, a family that was whole in a way it had not been for years. Nora stood in the ground floor of the Whitmore mill on the opening day and looked at the south wall, at the opening she'd made with a cold chisel and a masonry hammer on a cold morning 2 months after she'd moved into the cottage. The opening had been properly finished now, a doorway with a stone arch, connecting the main room to the sealed room, which had been cleared and cleaned and converted into a small display space where the vault was visible behind glass. The iron door opened to show the empty space below, the bars and coins gone to secure storage and the legal process of formal title, but the space itself present, the history of it present, the fact of it undeniable. She had stood at that south wall once with nothing and looked at it carefully enough to find something. She thought about the parking lot. She thought about the frost on the inside of the windshield and the peanuts eaten one at a time, and the night she'd bid $350 at midnight on a photograph of sagging limestone in a field and been the only bidder. She thought about all the people who had known the listing was there and had looked at it and looked away, because the price was low in a way that telegraphed problems, because the photograph told a story of neglect and expense, because the building had been empty for 46 years, and empty buildings in that condition were almost always empty for good reasons. She did not blame them for looking away. She had nearly looked away herself. She had sat in the dark in a parking lot for a long time before she submitted the bid, turning the thing over in her mind, arguing with herself about the gap between $358 and $350 and whether that $8 margin was wisdom or foolishness. She had submitted the bid because she had nothing left that worked, and so she had tried the thing that might not work, and it had worked, but not in any way that was about luck. It was about attention. It was about the specific quality of looking that comes when looking is all you have left, when you cannot afford to overlook anything, when every stone in a wall is worth examining because the only alternative is not examining it, and not examining it has already cost you everything you had. There was something in that, something she had tried to articulate in the 2 years since the story went public, and people had asked her to speak at events and write things and say on camera what it felt like and what it meant. She was not always good at the articulation, because the thing itself was not really articulable in any way that captured what it felt like to sit on a stone floor in a sealed room with a gold bar in your hand and feel the weight of it against 3 months of parking lots. But she had tried, in various rooms and at various podiums, to say something that was true. And what she'd come back to, each time, was this: the difference between the people who passed over that auction listing and the person who bid on it was not luck. It was not courage, particularly. It was need, and the attention that need produces when you let it. When you are out of other options, you look at what's in front of you differently. You stop looking for what you expect to find and start looking for what might be there. And sometimes what's there is something the world has forgotten it left behind. Harold Whitmore had left $442 million in a vault beneath a mill floor and trusted that the ground was more reliable than the systems men built above it. He had been right about the ground. He had perhaps not anticipated that the systems above it would fail his family in precisely the way they failed, leaving no one with both the need and the access to find what he'd left. But he had trusted the building to hold, and the building had held, for 77 years, until a woman with nothing arrived and looked carefully. The mill provided, the way Harold had hoped it would, for whoever needed it most. Nora turned away from the south wall and looked at her children across the room and felt the particular quality of that moment. Not triumph, not relief exactly, though both were present. Something steadier, something that had the weight of a gold bar and the lightness of a cleared debt. Something that was hers, built from the ground up, the way everything she'd kept had been built, by looking carefully at what was in front of her and refusing, absolutely refusing, to stop. Daniel called on a Tuesday, 9 days after the story ran nationally. The number came up as a Colorado area code she still had saved under his name in her phone, because deleting it had always felt like a statement she wasn't ready to make, and then she'd simply stop thinking about it. She was in the mill's ground floor when it rang, reviewing a revised contractor timeline for the second-floor framing with the lead carpenter, a methodical man named Roy who communicated primarily through nods and who had never once been late to a meeting. She looked at the screen. She told Roy she'd be 5 minutes. She stepped outside into the January air and answered. "I saw the news," Daniel said. His voice was the same. That was the first thing she noticed, with a detachment that surprised her. The particular cadence of it, the way he shaped his sentences, the slight pause before certain words. 11 years of marriage, and it was still right there, immediately recognizable. The voice she'd heard across kitchen tables, and in the dark, and through the wall of a bathroom, when she was already in the other room, trying to be somewhere else. "I know," she said. A pause. "Nora." Another pause. Daniel had always used silences as a form of communication, filling them with implication so he didn't have to be specific. "I wanted to call." "You called." "I wanted to say, I don't even know what I wanted to say. Congratulations doesn't feel like the right word." "It isn't," she said. She was standing on the stone step outside the main door, the same step she'd stood on the day she'd walked through for the first time, the same limestone, the same cold air off the creek. She looked at the tree and thought about what she wanted to say and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she didn't have a great deal to say. Not because she'd suppressed it. Because it had genuinely resolved itself, somewhere in the past 3 months, into something too small to require expression. "How are the kids?" he asked. "They're good. Marcus is applying to universities. Lily is reading everything she can find about the mill's history." That's good." He sounded like a man who understood that he had forfeited the right to ask follow-up questions about his children's lives and was feeling the specific weight of that forfeiture in real time. "I should have done better by them." "Yes," she said. She didn't say it with anger. She said it the way you say a true thing that no longer requires argument. "You should have. I know I stopped sending money. Things got complicated. With the business, with Daniel." She said it quietly. "I'm not going to have this conversation. I just want you to know that I understand what I did. What I didn't do." She thought about the alternator. She thought about the orthodontist bill and the $400 rent increase and the 11 weeks in the parking lot. She thought about Marcus double-checking the car doors at night without being asked and Lily's 2 questions about when they were going home and then the silence that replaced them. She thought about whether she wanted Daniel to understand all of that in the specific way she understood it, wanted him to carry the weight of it in the way she'd carried it, and found, testing that thought carefully, that she did not. Not because she was generous, or at least not only because of that. Because wanting it would cost her something she'd rather keep. "The kids are well," she said again. "They're going to be fine. They're already fine. They've been fine for a while now. Because of what you did. What you found. Because of what they are," she said. "The mill didn't make them who they are. 11 weeks in a parking lot did that more than the mill did. You don't need $400 million to become someone. You need to get through the thing that's trying to stop you and keep moving." They did that. They were 9 and 14 years old, and they did that. Daniel was quiet. "I want you to call them," she said. "Not because of any of this. Because they're your children, and they deserve to have their father call them. That's a separate thing from everything else, and it should have been happening regardless." Would they want me to? She thought about Marcus, who had not mentioned his father once in 3 months. About Lily, who had mentioned him twice, both times in the context of factual family history rather than longing or grievance. "I think they'd want the chance to decide," she said. "Give them the chance to decide." Another long pause. "Okay," he said. "Okay." She looked at the mill building beside her, at the pale limestone and the new window frames, and the 4th-floor roof rebuilt true and straight against the winter sky. A building that had been holding something for 77 years, waiting for the right circumstances to release it. She had always thought of the waiting as passive, as simply the passage of time. Standing here now, she thought about it differently. The building had not been passive. It had been patient. There was a difference. "I have to get back to work," she said. "Right? Of course." A beat. "I'm glad you found it, Nora. Whatever that's worth." She considered this. "It's worth something," she said. "Take care of yourself, Daniel." She ended the call and stood for another moment in the cold, looking at the tree line where the bare branches held the gray January sky in 100 places at once. Then she went back inside, where Roy was waiting with his timeline and his nods, and she got back to work. There was always work. That had not changed. That would not change. She was glad of it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.